Comic Geek Speak presents Murd's Time Bubble, the 32nd time. Welcome aboard the Time Bubble. I'm Adam Murdo, your ferryman to Funny Book Fantasyland, with reasonably priced excursions departing for the early 2000s and beyond at, well, let's just say at irregular intervals. Either every few months or every few minutes, depending on one's relative position in time. Don't believe me? Well, consider this. Once you've finished listening to this episode of the Time Bubble, you can either wait for the next one to come out, which will be, if we're being realistic, in a few months, probably, or you can go back and download one of my earlier episodes and begin listening to it in a few minutes. Isn't it wonderful how technology has liberated us all from the tyranny of linearity? But seriously, folks, now that I'm finished justifying the frustratingly irregular release schedule of this podcast for what must be about the 30th time, and I do appreciate all of you, my listeners, for your patience in between episodes, perhaps the time has come to get down to actually giving you some content. Beginning, of course, with the usual thanks that I always extend to those of you who have visited the comicforums.vanillacommunity.com to leave feedback on my last episode or two or three, in particular from the 31st time, to listeners Eric Nash and Chris Beckett, both of whom offered a bit of insight into the Just Imagine Stan Lee Creating series of one-shots, which were one of the foci of my last episode. I talked about Just Imagine Stan Lee Creating Green Lantern with Dave Gibbons. And thanks also to Chris for his extended comments about the Mr. E miniseries and a variety of other things. And thanks triply to Chris Beckett for the packet of John Byrne's Namor comics of the early 90s that he sent along to the CGS studio. Chris, I thank you for that. That parcel has been safely in my possession for some time now, and it is my hope that I will be able to talk a little bit about it on the main Comic Geek Speak podcast sometime before this Namor anniversary year ends. It's all just a matter of finding the time to go through them. And then hopefully that time will come over the summer when I've got a lot more free time for reading comics while engaged in sitting behind the counter of my family's shop in Stone Harbor, New Jersey. So hopefully there will be more to say about that at a later point on the CGS podcast. And something I hope I'll be able to share with the other guys once I'm done with them. I'm sure Chris Eberly at least will be interested in giving those a look. So thank you once again, Chris. While I'm at it, thanks also to Brian Kane, MWit80, and Tommy Forever. You have not been forgotten, Tommy, for chiming in about Hitman number 60, and to Eric Bennett, connoisseur of Golden Age obscurities that he is, for filling me in on the fact that a character called Mini Midget from Centaur Comics was actually the first shrinking character to appear in comics, beating out Quality Comics' Doll Man by a good 3 months back in 1939. Mini Midget. Well, that's a name that wouldn't exactly fly in the 21st century, but it's cool to know that such a character existed. Thank you for that, Eric. And last but never least, to Bionic Dave Goldschmidt for raising an interesting question in the talkback thread from my last episode concerning Just Imagine Stan Lee Creating Green Lantern. And that question being, was this in fact the first time any creator had written the color of Green Lantern to stand for the green of nature or Mother Earth? I've only been, and this is Dave talking now, not me. I've only been a B-level fan of GL through the years, and when I read James Robinson's New 52, Earth 2, I was under the impression that his take on his Earth 2 Alan Scott's power being somewhat linked to the green, a la Swamp Thing, instead of the Starheart or Oa, was something of a novel invention. But was it actually Stan Lee who came up with that first? A good question, and since nobody spoke up on the forum to answer one way or the other, I'm going to stick my neck on the line here and say that yes, Dave, it was Stan who came up with the actually rather startlingly obvious idea of linking the green of Green Lantern to the green of environmentalism and conservation. Granted, the story that he actually wrote in that Just Imagine one-shot didn't really expand on that idea very much, but the mere fact that he didn't use the idea very well doesn't change the fact that he did have it, and he certainly had it, if not first among all Green Lantern writers in comics, at the very least well before James Robinson had a similar idea in 2012. So there we are. Just imagine it. So then, up and away. Let's move forward into the time stream now, folks, as we approach the first historical marker on today's comics review itinerary. And when I say marker, the comic I'm going to talk about first is really, figuratively speaking, less a marker than a monument, and not really the celebratory kind. It's a comic that's an outgrowth of one of the most tragic and horrific events in the history of the United States. I mentioned last time I was going to talk about a comic book that was a pretty major milestone. And it's a milestone it is, major it is, but happy it is not. I'm referring here to Amazing Spider-Man Volume 2, number 36, which is the unforgettable September 11th, 2001 issue. And before I get into that, I think I also in an earlier episode or two stated my intention of prefacing my remarks in this comic with a few, well, it's becoming kind of a periodizing thing, I guess, amongst our generation to reflect on where one was at the time this happened. Kind of like the baby boomers had, what were you doing when Kennedy was shot? So I may as well fill in what my own status was on that particular day. Not going into too great length since we're here to talk about comics after all, but still, one must always contextualize, even as a reader and reviewer. So, September 11th, 2001. It was a day that was marked as kind of unusual for me from the very beginning. I was a couple of weeks into my ninth and final semester of college. I was up in State College, Pennsylvania, at the main campus of Penn State, where I was earning my degree in English. I was taking one class in postmodern literature, of all things, and I was doing an internship at a local business newspaper. So, learning a couple of things about journalism that I have since then pretty much totally forgotten. But on that particular day, that Tuesday morning, I was wearing a shirt and tie and khakis, which, again, unusual. I had kind of a full day ahead of me. I was going to be spending a little bit of time manning the Penn State Quiz Bowl team's table at the Penn State Involvement Fair, always held early in the fall semester, to give students a chance to go around and kind of shop, if you will, for extracurricular activities. Just meet and greet people who are involved in those activities, hear their spiel about why the students should want to do this or that thing. And then later that afternoon, I was going to go over to the enormous Bryce Jordan Center, the big basketball arena / concert venue on the Penn State campus, for a career fair of some kind. My memories of the whole thing are kind of a muddy swirl at this point, and nearly 20 years later, and frankly, after what happened that day, I'm pretty sure my memories of that day were a muddy swirl even that night. But I was in my car, my trusty old Volvo station wagon, pulling away from the townhouse complex outside of State College, which I called home at that time. I was a part-time student. I was commuting into the campus for my day's activities. And the radio DJ on the local classic rock station, to which I kept my dial tuned, mentioned some random news item about a plane apparently crashing into one of the World Trade Towers. I remember the DJ kind of laughing a little bit nervously about it and trying to make light of it, hoping that it was just a hoax or that it wasn't quite as bad as it sounded. I kind of envy his being able to get away with that for the very brief time that he could. But when I got myself into campus and went to the student union, the hub, as it's called, the Hetzel Union building, where the involvement fair was to happen, walking into the large, spacious, recently remodeled lobby, where there was a very large screen TV set up, and I saw a crowd of probably about 100 students gathered around this big screen TV watching the incoming news reports. I don't remember whether the second plane had crashed into the second tower yet at that point, but I could tell just by the atmosphere in the room that something very big and very bad was brewing up in New York. For the time, though, I just sort of tentatively went about my business, went over to the Hub Ballroom, which adjoined the lobby where the big screen TV was. That's where the involvement fair was happening. Met up with a couple of my fellow Quiz Bowl players, who were some of my closest friends in college. And just talked with them briefly about the involvement fair, about what was going on. The involvement fair was not very well attended at that point. Everyone's attention was appropriately glued to what was unfolding in New York. And I spoke to my friends, and it very quickly came down to everyone who was there in the room that the involvement fair was being canceled and rescheduled, because as the enormity of the events in New York were slowly dawning on everyone. So I guess we all just kind of folded tents, went our separate ways. I would ultimately meet up with my Quiz Bowl friends again later on that night to huddle together at a table at a campus burrito restaurant famous for burritos as big as your head, to just sort of commiserate and break bread and talk about the horrors unfolding. I sort of sleepwalked through the rest of the day. I mean, the attitude among just most of the people on campus was, well, it unfolded from one of mild disconcertion and incomprehension to one of total shell shock. Somewhere in between that transition, I got through the whole career fair, took a few business cards, attended a brief lecture or two, really didn't... I'm not sure even under the best of circumstances I would have gotten much out of that job fair that day, but under the circumstances. And so the day wore on, and the next few days as, well, virtual trauma set in on the campus community. I'm sure it was the same story in many of the places where you listening were on that day, whether at work or at school or with your families as much as possible, I hope. But those of us who were there at campus, I've remarked several times to anyone who will listen, including, I'm sure, once or twice on this or other Comic Geek Speak podcasts, how glad I was to be where I was. I mean, being with my family would have been nice too, but a college campus is also an excellent place to be when something is traumatizing and of such national import, global import even, as this unfolds. There are all kinds of different networks and support groups one can fit oneself into. I can remember the haze we were all in for the next several days. It was discussed at length in my postmodern literature class, since postmodernism has a way of incorporating just about any phenomenon of any cultural impact into itself. So it was kind of an interesting, slightly irreverent, but still comforting filter through which to experience the horrors of that day. And there were all kinds of little improvised prayer vigils and consolation meetings and things happening. There were rallies and speeches given on various lawns of various campus buildings. I was glad that we had our cable bill paid up back at our little townhouse, my two roommates and I, because we were certainly paying a lot of attention to the major news broadcasts. One channel we weren't able to watch, of course, was WPIX-11 out of New York City, because its major broadcast tower was, of course, in one of the towers of the World Trade Center that fell. But, yeah, just the knowledge of all the carnage that were committed, all the lives that were lost. It was, as I'm sure you're all aware, hugely sobering for all of us as a nation. Made a few ripples beyond the United States, too, no doubt. But it shocked all of us as a nation, a people, a culture, out of a kind of torpor, a kind of national cynicism and jadedness that had reached almost comatose proportions among some of us. And, well, it gave us all a different way of looking at ourselves very quickly, as individuals and as a national culture. And that's national tragedy does tend to do that. And the shockwaves were felt on every level of American life. And comic books, naturally, are no exception, just as a way of providing myself a slightly awkward segue back to the subject of comics, as if any segue I would use could be anything other than at least slightly awkward, but that is, after all, what this podcast is supposed to be about. But yeah, certainly there were some blips in the distribution schedule of the major comic books. I'm pretty sure that no new comics arrived at my LCS, the Comic Swap, the following day, for example. Not that I was really in much of a mood to go and buy them, even if they had arrived on time. But, of course, the medium of comics and the creative community behind it had quite a few things to say about this attack, this act of international terrorism, this mass murder perpetrated on American shores. And the first of those, of course, is the comic. The first and not last. And the one that's probably best remembered by many of us participating in this podcast discussion here would have been Amazing Spider-Man Volume 2, number 36. Which carries a cover date of December of 2001, which would ordinarily mean that it would have hit shelves in October of that year, and I'm almost positive that it didn't actually. I mean, there are ways of verifying that. I didn't go to that length, but I'm almost sure that this comic, it took longer than 1 month after the actual events of that day to find its way to the hands of readers. But it just carries that cover date because I guess that's when the 36th issue of the Amazing Spider-Man Monthly would have come out. It was this issue was brought to you, of course, by the then regular Amazing Spider-Man creative team of J. Michael Straczynski and John Romita Jr., with inks by Scott Hanna. Well, one must begin, of course, when talking about this issue with the very famous cover, which was all black, naturally. In the years since, this approach to a cover has been used a few times as kind of a quick, lazy idea for a cover variant. But at the time, it was untried, it was impactful, it's certainly nothing that any of the major publishers had ever tried before. It was intended to be solemn and funereal and expressive of kind of a national mood of grief and horror. It's almost like a shroud pulled over the images of carnage and also heroism, make no mistake, but just some of the horrible things that that national disaster entailed, and that were, to one extent or another, depicted in the comic that lay below said iconic black cover. Featured nothing but the title, The Amazing Spider-Man, the number 36, and, of course, the Marvel Comics cover logo. And in those days, the cover treatment for the Marvel Comics logo was just the words Marvel Comics extended across the entire upper margin of the cover. This was a cover treatment that Marvel didn't use for a very long time. I mean, they were somewhat reminiscent of the old black band across the top of the cover with Marvel Comics Group inside of it that identified Marvel Comics of the 70s. But yeah, they reverted to a form of cover box fairly soon after that. But in 2001, it's what they did. And it's what appears on the top of the cover of Amazing Volume 2, number 36. The names of the creators. Now, this is something that Marvel kind of was much into doing at that time, at least giving you the surnames of the three primary creators of each comic they did. Those were omitted. But not the mighty Marvel masthead. And then turning over the cover, we find a front page that pretty closely mirrors the stark black of the cover. It's just a solid black page with some white printing in the middle, which reads, "We interrupt our regularly scheduled program to bring you the following special bulletin." And down in the lower right, a pair of little narrative captions, the first of many such captions that will guide the reader through what follows. And they say, longitude 74 degrees 0 minutes 23 seconds west. Latitude 40 degrees 42 minutes 51 seconds north. Follow the sound of sirens. And then turn the page and be confronted with a beautiful yet hideous 2-page splash by John Romita Jr. and friends of Ground Zero, the still flaming wreckage of the World Trade Towers, and in the foreground, the figure of Spider-Man standing on a high skyscraper ledge, clutching his head in his hands and saying, "God." I don't think I'm going to live to see too many more powerful images in the pages of a comic. I mean, just resonating very, very strongly, of course, with real-world events. And just accomplishing what the creators were setting out to do right off the bat, I think. And what follows, of course, only enhances the reading experience, but... yeah. And what follows in and of itself, I mean, it's a little difficult for me to even summarize, because this issue is not really very big on structure or plot or any of those traditional narrative elements, because it's not really much of it's not really a story, nor was it really intended to be. I think I actually remember reading a quote from Straczynski himself around the time, who, in his own words, said something like, as far as he's concerned, this was less a story than a grieving process. It's just a way for him to get his own emotions clear about this horrible occurrence, and come up with his own observations and reactions thereto. And sure enough, that's what the following pages are really full of, just very visceral, emotional reactions. It's highly, and reflections and statements on things like the nature of evil and heroism, and the ordinary human beings who responded in their various ways to what took place in New York City that day. It's highly imagistic and stream of consciousness. It really doesn't follow the pattern of a story so much as it's kind of a free-form emotional essay with a great deal of illustration. I might, from the other point of view, that of art, describe it as a 20-page memorial mural with a lot of captions and a few superhero cameos thrown in. The last page in particular feels like a mural, like something that ought to be painted on the side of a building somewhere within a few blocks of the actual event. Romita Jr.'s drawing of various, the real heroes of 9/11. The emergency workers, the first responders, lined up in front of an American flag with the heads of several prominent Marvel characters kind of stuck in the back, under the caption, "Stand Tall." And that is how the issue ends. So there you are. Again, it's not a traditionally structured story, per se, in that it doesn't have a very clear beginning, middle, and ending. There are a few occurrences that happen in the middle. I mean, for the most part, as I said, it's more like an illustrated essay than it is a story. Straczynski seems apt to forget, in the throes of his personal grief and national grief, that he's working in the Marvel Universe with Marvel characters. Ostensibly, he's writing in the voice of Peter Parker, seeing things through his eyes, although there are quite a few points where it becomes fairly obvious that he's just kind of straying away and throwing in his own observations. There's a couple of moments where Peter actually does directly interact with what's happening down below. There's one scene where Peter tries to comfort a little boy whose father, the boy says, just went into the World Trade Center just for a few minutes to get something he'd left inside. And then, just at that moment, the boy beholds firefighters carrying his father's body out of the wreckage, and he screams, and Spider-Man struggles futilely, numbly to console him. There's another moment where Spider-Man observes Captain America. He's kind of standing at a high point amid the wreckage, his shield embedded in the rubble at his feet, just kind of staring stoically into space, practically trembling with barely contained sadness and impotent fury. And Spider-Man reflects that as kind of the token representative of the greatest generation among those Marvel characters present. Quote, "He's the only one who could know, because he's been here before. I wish I had not lived to see this once. I can't imagine what it is to see this twice. I just can't imagine." So a couple of powerful Marvel character moments thrown in there. But for the most part, I mean, Straczynski's use of the Marvel characters here is really... It's largely symbolic, I would argue. More symbolic than literal. I'd go so far as to argue that the story isn't really taking place... It's obviously not happening in the real world New York City, because there's no superheroes living there, obviously enough. It doesn't seem to me like it's quite taking place in the Marvel Universe New York City either, but rather it's kind of happening in an existential shadow zone where the two shade into one another, if that makes sense. It's a point where the Marvel characters, for the space of this one issue, kind of have a very strong, overwhelming flash of metatextual awareness, and kind of halfway manifest themselves in the world of the real human beings, who create them and whose fantasies they exist to fuel. So it's almost as if that they're meeting in a version of New York City where their two realities intersect. And the heroes, they're mostly shown working in humble, seamless cooperation with, again, the first responders, the real-world heroes of 9/11. You see images of everyone from Daredevil to Ben Grimm to Vision and Scarlet Witch, just helping to save as many lives as they possibly can. And it's easy enough if one wants to, for most of the issue, to imagine that this is all happening in the real world, New York City, and that the heroes are not physically present so much as they are hovering over the activities of the first responders as it's like guardian angels, almost like cherubim or patron saints hovering over the doings of flesh and blood human beings in like classical religious art. That's one way of looking at it. It just seems like their presence in spirit is more important than anything that the characters are actually doing in the story. It's another way to think of it is that JMS is just kind of using them as therapy puppets as much as he is as characters, because goodness knows he and many other people in the world at that time needed that kind of help. And this idea of the Marvel characters as functioning on something less than a literal level in this story may be useful in addressing what was probably the most controversial element of this story, in fan circles at least at the time. And that was the scene that occurs on page 9, where Straczynski treats us to an image of a small group of very prominent Marvel Universe supervillains standing around in the wreckage at Ground Zero, and, not betraying much reaction for the most part. But we've got Magneto, of course. We've got Dr. Octopus, the Juggernaut, Wilson Fisk, the Kingpin, and Dr. Doom. And the bottom panel on that page is an extreme close-up of Doom's face. You can see his eyes beneath his iron mask, and the captions read, "Because even the worst of us, however scarred, are still human, still feel, still mourn the random death of innocence." And we see tears standing forth in Doom's eyes, weeping like Iron Eyes Cody, or I guess in his case, Iron Face Cody. So there was some debate at the time as to how really appropriate, within the context of the Marvel Universe anyway, it would be to have Doom appear on the site of an occurrence like this and actually weeping about it. The answer, I'm of two minds about this. I mean, I do think there are two answers to give to this question. The first answer I'm going to give is the one that I gave at the time, which is, within the context of the Marvel Universe, treating these characters as denizens of a fictional reality with fictional motivations, and in some cases a deep burning hatred for their fellow fictional denizens of this place. Looking at these villains this way, they definitely would not, or at least most of them wouldn't. Wilson Fisk adores New York City. It's his home, it's his hunting grounds, his mistress, the list goes on. He would be bawling his eyes out at the sight of something like this happening, and he would use every last scrap of underworld influence he happens to have afterwards to seek revenge on those who perpetrated this. Juggernaut and Dr. Octopus, harder to say. Magneto, he's been classified as a terrorist himself on more than one occasion, and has spilled his share of non-mutant blood. I'm not sure how broken up he would be about something like this. Doom, if he thought it would benefit his own people of Latveria and his own ends, his own empire-building goals, I don't think he would, again, fictional Doom, fictional Marvel Universe, would stop short for an instant of perpetrating something like this himself. But if we stop regarding these characters in terms of their lives and motivations within the fictional construct that is the Marvel Universe, and start thinking of them more as extensions of the collective popular imagination of the Western world, the United States in particular, it's at that point that the reaction of these characters, and yes, even Weeping Doom, begins to make sense. As they're witnessing not just the wreckage of their own New York City, but they sense a greater, higher cosmic import, suffering among the mysterious, unseen overpeople who give rise to their lives and with whom they are hopelessly and inextricably intermeshed and linked. They sense that suffering in the minds of those that create them, and on some meta level understand that there is a greater New York and a greater loss of life than anything that they experience in their little four-color existences. And it is for that reason, I think, that the reaction of these villains on that page can be justified. I hope that makes some sense to those of you listening. But yeah, if a fictional tragedy like this happened in the Marvel Universe, safe to say that these villains probably wouldn't give two hoots for the most, except, of course, for Kingpin. So there's that. Yep, I've got to tell you, folks, it hasn't been easy for me to figure out exactly what to say about this issue. I mean, I think it's best that if you haven't read this comic, and if you have memories of your own about 9/11, you should probably hunt it down in original form or in reprint, more likely in reprint, and give it a read at some point. I feel strange saying anything about it that even approaches a critique, because it can't help but make one feel petty. You know, it makes you feel as if you're giving notes to a funeral orator on the eulogy he just gave. But still, as I said, it doesn't. It's not a story by the proper definition. Even its writer admitted so, that for him it was less a story than a mechanism for dealing with grief. But whatever it may lack in traditional story value or structure is more than recompensed in its evocation of the emotional rawness, numbness, and then rawness again, the pain, the confusion, the anger, the loss of the sense of innocence, of security in which we as a nation had swaddled ourselves, the loss of national identity, that came to us all in one form or another, to one degree or another, in those traumatic times at the beginning of the first decade of this new century. It's reading it kind of brings to mind, the many overpowering feelings that came to myself and to many of those people I knew at the time. And it was kind of a helpful and cathartic to read, as I'm sure it was to the creative team to produce, Straczynski in particular. And it is, at the very least, an invaluable time capsule of national tragedy. And one of the side benefits of doing a podcast such as this one is the opportunity to occasionally reopen and revisit such time capsules and experience certain things that deserve never to be forgotten all over again. So I'm happy to have reminded all of you, or perhaps in some cases introduced all of you, to this particular work in the comics medium that is of quite a bit of broader cultural significance, and which I must recommend to all of you for simple historical value, if not for its emotional value, which is also quite great. I did mention that this is not the only comic book to address the issues and the events and the phenomenal human sacrifice of 9/11. As a matter of fact, there is an ad, and it should be added. It works against Marvel Comics, the publisher of this issue, for this, I think. But this comic book does contain ads. They're not even edited. They're not even all concentrated to the back of the comic, so that they don't interfere with or intrude into one's reading experience of the comic. They're just the usual, very colorful comic book ads for Nickelodeon cartoons and video games and candy and Oscar Mayer Lunchables and things of that nature. They're just interspersed right in the middle of the story, and it does kind of detract from the dignity of the whole affair, and one must do have to question Marvel's decision to go ahead and do that. I mean, they didn't need to omit the ads entirely. I understand they still had a budget to keep, and but they could at least have done what Wildstorm was, I know for a fact, was doing at that time and had been doing for years, and that is to just concentrate all the ads that run in one of their comics to the back of the issue to make them less obtrusive. But one ad, though, inside the inside front cover, is for a compendium called Heroes. The world's greatest superhero creators honor the world's greatest heroes, 9/11/2001. That was being released through Dynamic Forces, and it contains work by, to name a few, Neil Adams, John Cassaday, Neil Gaiman, Jay Lee, Frank Miller, Alan Moore, George Perez, Joe Quesada, Alex Ross, who provided a cover of a firefighter carrying a shadowed human form from the wreckage of the towers, and Kevin Smith. All proceeds to go to the families of the FDNY and NYPD that lost loved ones in the attack on America. And that was a pretty speedy response from the comics community to what happened in 2001. And that still was not the last, because both DC and Dark Horse each released their own volume of comics under the title 9/11. All of them treating the same theme, of course, and with the same, I believe, at least charitable ends. So, more reads on the subject, more responses from the comics community on this subject. That's certainly something that no historical podcast treading the dangerous waters of those fraught and traumatic times of 2001, 2002 can afford to avoid mentioning. Before I move on, let me extend the usual invitation request, and perhaps with an added note of entreaty this time, to those of you listening to visit thecomicforums.vanillacommunity.com and post in the upcoming talkback thread for this episode of The Time Bubble any memories you may have about that comic or other comics related to 9/11 that you can remember reading back at the time of publication, and memories you may have of the 9/11 tragedy itself. In particular, those of you who happen to be living in New York City at the time. And I do know, and somewhat intimately, a few of you, and you know who you are, because your perspective on this tragedy and the ensuing response to it is bound to be more valuable and than mine can ever be. So, yes, please do feel free to come to the Time Bubble and sound off about The Amazing Spider-Man number 36 and what was going on in your life as a comic book reader or just as a human being at the time all of this happened. And one final thought, then, with which I'll leave you all. Something else to chew upon and perhaps also to respond to on the forum thread when it appears. It does seem to me that here we are, some 17 and a half, 18 years after the 9/11 events. It has, sad to say, been about enough time for us to forget some of the lessons that we learned from the horrors that occurred back then. And it seems to me that we've regrown some of the protective shell that was ripped off of us by the 9/11 attacks, that thanks to things like the internet and social media and the ever-present ubiquitous mobile availability of thousands and thousands of hours of escapist entertainment, we've kind of become more self-insulated and desensitized and disaffected than ever before. And I can't just help, perhaps cynically, perhaps not, I don't know how fair I'm being to myself in asking this question, but if another event comparable to 9/11 were to occur today, how would we respond to it now? And, well, less importantly overall, but perhaps somewhat less importantly for the purposes of a podcast such as this, how would comics respond? I mean, all we can really do is sit around and idly speculate, while at the same time hoping with every last living cell of our beings that we never get an actual answer to that question. Some things we just don't want to find out. Enough said, folks. All right, that was inevitably rather heavy, just revisiting those times and those awful happenings. There's no other way to describe it. It's a heavy trip. So let's push the time bubble into further reverse here. Let's move on to somewhat lighter matters and move on back to talk about one or two older comics. A few more things that I dug out of those. The occasionally appearing cheap bins, like the 50 or 25 cent bins that occurred at the semi-annual sales that the Comic Swap in State College would have. I mentioned a bunch of things I bought from those sales in my last episode, and I've got yet a couple more to talk about at some moderate length here in this episode. The first of which is one of the lesser-known 1980s works of one of my favorite writers of all time, or comics writers, anyway, of all time, Roy Thomas, in partnership with his wife, Dan. It's a 4-issue miniseries entitled Jonni Thunder, that's Jonni now, a.k.a. Thunderbolt. So I do have the first issue here, which is cover dated February of 1985, which would put it on shelves and newsstands about 2 months before Crisis on Infinite Earths was destined to begin. So, Crisis broke about midway through this 4-issue miniseries, so rocking the boat a little bit. And I do believe that Jonni Thunder did manage to make an appearance in that maxi-series before it concluded. Actually, several Jonni Thunders did, but this one in particular, the most recent. This miniseries was created by Roy and Dan Thomas, as I said. And I'm glad that Roy was working in partnership with his wife for this one, because the protagonist is female. Jonni Thunder is a female character, so it's good to have that authentic female POV injected in there. The art is by the legendary Dick Giordano, pencils and inks, who was at that time also serving as editorial vice president of DC Comics, basically editor-in-chief. And also receiving a fairly important credit in this comic is Jerry Conway, who is credited as being the co-plotter of the miniseries and also the co-creator of its title character. Now, what we have here is an entry by Roy and Dan Thomas and Company into the time-honored genre of the private eye story, a genre that like most other genres that weren't superheroes, was somewhat underrepresented in the comic scene of the mid-1980s. But Roy had always had a soft spot for classic detective fiction, and his wife apparently developed a taste for it herself while on their honeymoon. So Roy tells us in the obligatory text piece in the back of this first issue. And it is absolutely, it's unequivocally influenced. Jonni Thunder is, that is, by such fiction, both in print and especially on film. Most particularly the Philip Marlowe stories of Raymond Chandler. On the front cover, the tagline is, "Magnum and Marlowe, make room! Here comes Jonni Thunder, a.k.a. Thunderbolt." So, throwing Magnum in there and putting him in parallel to Marlowe. I guess one classic PI and one contemporary PI. The story is steeped in the rampant cinephilia of the time. There was an absolute, a powerful trend in the early 1980s of nostalgia for classic film, especially of pre-code Hollywood, the 1930s, to a lesser extent the 40s, which is when people like The Thin Man and Marlowe first found their way onto celluloid. So it doesn't hurt that the story is set in L.A., so there's all kinds of movie-land memorabilia and classic old-time film conventions, noir and otherwise, in which the story wallows like a pig in slop. Until, of course, the jarring introduction of elements from the then inevitable superhero and sci-fi genres. We'll get to that a little bit later on. But yeah, it's very much a love letter to classic PI stories. The main character, Johnny, comes right out and says, as part of her hard-boiled first-person narration, provided in caption form throughout the issue, that Philip Marlowe was her hero, and she strove to emulate him in pretty much every aspect of her life. So, yeah, there's plenty of classic film buff stuff scattered throughout the issue. As a matter of fact, for an additional Hollywood connection, the whole idea of Jonni Thunder actually originated from a collaboration between Roy Thomas and Jerry Conway on a screenplay that was destined never to be produced. But during that time, they kind of got to talking dreamily about their shared love of detective fiction and decided that they wanted to bring a PI character back to mainstream comics. And they came up with this character, and I guess Roy Thomas was then able to bring it to DC successfully and get her slated for a miniseries. Not hurting too much that he's resurrecting kind of a classic DC Comics name for the character. In fact, one of the topics treated by Roy's text piece at the back of the first issue is the provenance of the Jonni Thunder name. He touches on the various characters who had used it over the years, the JSA member, the cowboy character, etc. So this debut issue is entitled Not in the Stars, but in Ourselves, which is paraphrased from Shakespeare as opposed to Chandler. A little odd, although the first issue does begin with an epigraph from Raymond Chandler's story. California, the most of everything, the best of nothing, from the novel The Little Sister. And we join the action and meet our protagonist, Jonni, on a dark and stormy night, as lightning bolts in a mysteriously female human shape dance and crash overhead. Jonni Thunder is just returning to town after 2 weeks away for the funeral of her father, Jim Thunder, who had been... in the old days, he was a stunt rider for old Hollywood westerns before he became a police officer. So he's kind of an ideal connection between the dual themes or preoccupations of this miniseries of the law and the cinema. The way Jonni tells it, Jim Thunder had kind of... he was a principled man with a pretty strong temper, and he was just a little bit too ethical to... to put it in Johnny's words... she says, the police review board jerked his badge for, quote, insubordination, or so they said. Dad always preferred to call it refusing a bribe. So there you go. We're told at some later point in the story that Jim Thunder had a little bit of Cherokee blood in him, which I guess was the Thomas's way of explaining the somewhat unusual surname Thunder. But anyway, Jim Thunder was dead to begin with. Very conveniently died about 2 weeks before the start of our story. And Jonni, who is learned quite a few valuable lessons from her old man, who raised her alone after her mother died young. So she was a gritty, self-sufficient lady of the 80s, by way of the 30s. Yeah, she's kind of an old-fashioned soul, in that she idolizes hard-boiled detectives of about 50 years ago. She affected really sharp, monochromatic, tailored suits, usually all white with a black undershirt, or like the negative of that, all black with a white shirt. And then, of course, there's that tough-talking inner monologue that guides us through the entire story, and that air of total self-reliance that she projects everywhere she goes and everything she does. Yeah, she was a strong woman of the sort that wasn't all that common in comics at the time, and that... I would call her ahead of her time. She'd feel more comfortable in the comics of today, actually. Anyway, we join her. She returns to the office that she shared with her former partner, her dad, recently deceased, the J. Thunder Investigations Agency, to find a dead man in the office. And her day just gets worse from there. So she has to endure a police investigation of this mysterious stranger whose name and reason for visiting her office she never even learns in this first issue. The mystery is just beginning to unfold. But she receives an anonymous phone tip, which drags her to the La Brea tar pits. We get kind of a mini tour of the L.A. geography in the course of all 4 issues of this miniseries, since Roy did live out there for a time. So he has a little bit of first-hand experience. So she goes to the La Brea tar pits, very quickly realizes that the phone call was just a ploy to get her out of the office. She speeds back there and finds, of all things, some kind of robotic arthropod, a clockwork cockroach, if you will. And I know I will. The question is, will you? Rifling through her personal effects, looking for something. She is... It's metal-plated. She's barely able to disable it in any way. The best she can do at first is just to throw it out her window, and then battles it to a standstill out in the alley. The police... it self-destructs at the end of the battle, so there's no evidence remaining. When she goes to the police about it, the best they can do is dredge up a witness in the person of a drunken bum who had seen the whole fight, he claims, in the alley, and claims that there was no cockroach present. So the plot thickens. Later, Jonni gets to meet up with old-time film cowboy Clarence Slim Chance, as old-time Western yodeler who's concealing a black hat, so to speak. You know, his motives are not all that his folksy Will Rogers air or persona make it out to be. Who invites her over ostensibly to commiserate on the death of her father, with whom he used to work on old Western pictures. Like, he was the stunt rider, and Slim Chance was the face, the performer, the singer. But he's the one who ended up parlaying a career out of Johnny's dad's stunt work. But anyway, he calls her up and ends up talking more to her about an old lamp that her father had in his possession. Well, actually not a lamp, a statue, as far as Slim Chance knows. And it's then that Johnny's detective skills start to kick in, and she starts to piece her recent run of bad luck together and realizes that everything that's happened to her since she got back from her father's funeral has been connected. And it's then that we learn that this mysterious statue, which is made of golden metal, so Slim Chance tells her, and is shaped like a woman who looks something like Johnny herself, coincidentally, wink wink, but made out of lightning, like crackling electricity. Johnny recognizes the description, but doesn't let on to Slim Chance that she does, and quickly hurries home to lay hands as quickly as possible on this object in which Slim Chance is taking such an unnatural interest. We discover at that point that she has indeed had this statue with her all along. It's kind of present in the background of the early events of the first issue, which is not at all decompressed, I might add here. There's a lot happening in the first issue of this 4-issue miniseries. But apparently this statue had been in her father's possession for decades now. He'd had it converted into a lamp. And the story of how Detective Jim Thunder got his hands on the statue in the first place is not a plot point that withstands scrutiny. The story goes somewhat like the statue was smuggled into the country after having been stolen from a South American temple by a desperate character who killed in cold blood to obtain it. But once he got into the States, he was quickly arrested by LAPD police, including Jim Thunder, on unrelated charges. And apparently Detective Jim Thunder was nice to him while placing him under arrest. He must have made a really good impression on this smuggler guy, because he apparently somehow made arrangements for this precious statue to be mailed to his arresting officer for safekeeping. It doesn't really follow that this would, of all people, this would be the person that this murderous smuggler would choose to safeguard his treasure. And then there's the additional question of how he even managed to get it into the mail to Jim Thunder after he'd already been placed under arrest. I mean, if there was somebody on the outside whom he trusted enough to take this precious statue and package it and mail it to Detective Thunder, you'd think he'd probably trust that person far enough to just keep it for him until he got out of jail. But all that is neither here nor there. The fact is, Johnny does still have this statue in lamp form. The reason the robotic cockroach didn't find it when it broke into her office, because we all pretty quickly, along with Johnny, tumbled to the conclusion that that's what the roach was there to get, is because the very first thing Johnny does, apparently, at the beginning of the issue, when she comes back to her office and finds a dead man inside of it, is to pick up the lamp from where it had fallen on the floor. The dead guy had apparently knocked it over with his arm when he was shot by whoever shot him for whatever reason, and broke the lamp a little bit, or at least the electrical components of it were broken. The statue itself was still intact, fortunately for the rest of the plot. But Johnny at that point leaves the office, tells her friend down the hall to call the police because there's a dead guy in her office, and then she leaves the building and goes immediately to the repair shop to drop off her lamp. Which doesn't seem to me very plausible as the first thing a person in her position, and especially with her background and training, would do upon discovering a murder victim, is to go and drop off her lamp to be repaired. But it needed to be somewhere other than her office when the clockwork cockroach showed up to rifle the place. There's just a couple of things that don't add up in this plot that could have been done. I'm sure Roy and Dan Thomas could have come up with a better reason why the robot cockroach didn't find the lamp, and a better reason how the lamp came to be in the Thunder family's possession in the first place if they just tried a little harder. But there's no point in poking holes in 35-year-old plots, really, if we're being honest here. But anyway, the point is, Jonni Thunder goes and gets her hands on her electric lady lamp, with deepest apologies to Jimi Hendrix and to anybody else who heard me just make that pun. And then Another tip comes to her from Slim Chance himself to meet her at the Griffith Observatory, another L.A. landmark, as seen in Rebel Without a Cause, and much more recently in La La Land. And there she meets up with none other than the same drunken bum who claimed not to have seen her wrestling with a robotic insect a little while ago. This time he's armed with a Buck Rogers-style disintegrator pistol and demanding that she hand over the statue. A fracas breaks out, of course, during which time the statue gets irradiated by an old Zeiss projector, a classic movie prop that happens to be on display at the observatory at that time. So, more classic film memorabilia. It electrifies the statue while Jonni is holding it, and that little zap imparts Jonni with superhuman powers. All right, so here's where the superhero sci-fi elements intrude. So you know that most private investigator characters have their inner demons. We learn at this moment that Johnny's inner demons are the kind that get out. And that's exactly what happens thanks to the influence of this mysterious statue. As soon as she gets zapped, she falls unconscious on the floor, and the power that she gains is somewhat similar to that of Negative Man of the Doom Patrol, shall we say. She is able to kind of astral project an energy self, a being that kind of is vaguely shaped like her normal human body, but it's made out of pure electrical energy. And at least it is just garden-variety electricity, as opposed to whatever kind of freaky-deaky black hole negative energy Larry Traynor traffics in the Doom Patrol. So she's able to, in this form, her normal human body is unconscious and vulnerable, but for the short time she's able to exist outside of her body, her consciousness passes into this electrical form, and she can fly around and zap people with lightning bolts and stuff. And this is how she's able to frighten her assailant half out of his wits. He flees from the observatory and promptly falls off a cliff, since Griffith Observatory is located on a fairly high elevation part of town. And that's kind of how the first issue ends, as Jonni naturally finds herself with more questions than answers, and the search for those answers is what fills the remaining 3 issues of the miniseries, as you could probably guess. And along the way, we're introduced to an interesting supporting cast. There's Mike Sanchez, handsome young LAPD detective who shows up to the scene of the crime, the murder of the man in Johnny's office. That's kind of their meet-cute. He's strongly implied to be a possible love interest for Jonni. There's Leon Bergstrom, one of Johnny's friends in town. He's a kindly old bookseller who affects a beret and a long-stem cigarette holder. He runs a store that not only sells books, but classic movie posters and other movie memorabilia. He's a probable Hollywood blacklist victim from decades past. There's Slim Chance himself, whom we've already covered at some length. There's the neighbor, whom Jonni calls upon to call the police when she finds the dead body in her office. His name is Sunshine, and he is the owner and sole proprietor of the Have a Happy telephone answering service. Something of a quaint concept here in the 21st century, and was swiftly becoming quaint even as far back as 1984. But there is kind of a retro film noir PI nostalgic vibe to this entire miniseries, so why not have a supporting character be a telephone answering service operator? Sunshine, it's pretty strongly implied that he's gay, actually. He wears a pink I Heart New York t-shirt at all times, and there's other little clues in the text. And in his behavior, he does skew a bit stereotypical in his portrayal, but, at least he's there. To have a gay character represented in any capacity in a comic of the mid-'80s is kind of a big deal. So I'm kind of proud of the Thomases for finding a place for him in this narrative, anyway. And last but not least, Jonni Thunder acquires a pet before this story is over. Again, talking about how stuffed this issue is, she just, on arriving at Griffith Observatory, she finds a small rabbit just kind of sitting there in the grassy lawn in front of the observatory in the middle of the driving rain and looking miserable. And for some reason, this wild animal just allows Jonni to walk right up to it, pick it up as if it were a thing of plush, and stuff it into her purse. And so she acquires a pet rabbit. I'm always a fan of animal sidekicks in comics, and now Jonni Thunder has hers. She names it Seamus, which is the perfect name for the pet of any detective to have, if you ask me. Now, so begins the saga of the Tinseltown detective known as Jonni Thunder. Yes, it's just somewhat enjoyable. It's a dense read, as I said, but it's an underrepresented genre, especially at that time in comics history, and it's a lesser known opus of one of my favorite writers. So I'm happy to have it in my collection. Though I will say that the aforementioned hard-boiled inner monologue of Jonni, the PI patois in which she speaks, it does get a little bit labored after a while, especially when Roy and Dan Thomas try to mash it up with a few contemporary references. There's one particular scene, just to give you an example, where Jonni is racing in her vintage 50s convertible to the La Brea tar pits on a wild goose chase. And she's thinking to herself, "The Tinseltown traffic's heavy and moving slower than a corrupt cop frisking a hooker, forcing me to do some risky lane jumping like I was Ms. Pac-Man from hell." See what I mean? A little bit forced and also a little bit dated to the contemporary ear, but that's certainly not something that we can ex post facto lay at the feet of the Thomases. So, yeah. And the character of Jonni Thunder was not much used at the end of this miniseries. Roy Thomas himself, of course, continued to make use of her during the rest of his time as a DC writer there in the mid-'80s. He actually fairly quickly wrote her into his Infinity Inc. series. She became a supporting character there because the Infinity Inc. Team, after all, was also based in L.A. They used the lot of the Stellar Movie Studios, which was owned by their leader and benefactor Sylvester Pemberton, alias the Star-Spangled Kid, alias Skyman. So it made sense that another L.A.-based character and crime fighter, Jonni Thunder, would end up teaming up with him eventually, and she became a regular supporting character and potential love interest, that is, for the aforementioned Sylvester Pemberton, until the tragic death of same, of course. All of this, of course, took place post-crisis, because it must be mentioned, particularly must be mentioned by me, the CGS staff crisisophile and crisisologist, that there's some confusion. It didn't really have much chance to become an issue, because, as I said, Jonni Thunder's miniseries began about the same time that Crisis on Infinite Earths did, but there might have eventually been some confusion as to which universe Jonni Thunder, a.k.a. Thunderbolt, called home. Presumably she would have been an Earth 1 character, because otherwise people would have been comparing her to that guy with the bow tie from the Justice Society all the time. But by the time the chips all fell where they may, Infinity Inc. and Jonni Thunder, and all other remaining surviving DC characters for that matter, all dwelt on the same single combined Earth, post-crisis. So, Roy Thomas didn't need to come up with any kind of device for how Jonni Thunder with an I found her way to Earth 2 and teamed up with his other characters of Infinity Inc. They were all on the same Earth, so it was all just kind of a happy... one happy thing to come out of Crisis on Infinite Earths for poor Roy Thomas, anyway. So shortly after she was introduced to Infinity Inc., one of the first things that Roy did with Jonni Thunder, actually, was a plot line in which she was separated from her Thunder self, this energy being that she was able to split off and extrude and send around to do battle for herself, her superhero element. Now, in the text piece at the end of Jonni Thunder #1, Roy Thomas goes on record as saying that he and Jerry Conway were excited about the idea of cross-pollinating the private investigator and superhero genres in comics. My takeaway is that Roy wasn't really all that excited about that. He mainly introduced and spliced in the superhero angle to make his new PI character seem like an easier sell in what was then a superhero-dominated comics marketplace. It never really seemed quite endemic or natural to her character. No, to anybody reading the miniseries, I don't think, but least of all to Jonni herself. This whole business with her being a hard-boiled private eye, but also she could be Lightning Lady whenever she wanted. So eventually, this superpower of hers, this bioelectric aura she could send forth and project her intelligence into, was revealed as a a separate being from herself, like a malevolent, parasitic alien energy being that had been trapped inside of that little statuette that her dad had turned into a lamp, and that kind of bonded with her, and at first allowed her to be like the dominant personality, to be in the driver's seat, allowed Jonni to think that this energy being was just an extension of herself. But well, in the meantime, this malign alien intelligence was just biding its time to strike and to separate itself from Jonni and to find itself a mate, which it very nearly does by using Sylvester Pemberton, Star-Spangled Kid, or Skyman, as a host. This entity's name, incidentally, and I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, lest I offend any denizens of her home dimension who might be listening in, was Mzztxl. Mzzttexxal. And the sad thing is I didn't even need to look that up to know it. So, she was kind of... So, Jonni's superhero dimension, that aspect of her character was effectively exorcised from her in Infinity Inc., revealed to be a malign alien presence and defeated and done away with. And we were left with just plain old Jonni Thunder, private detective, and which I think is probably what Roy Thomas would have been happier writing all along. But anyway, he continued to make use of her in Infinity Inc., and then Infinity Inc. went away, and Jonni Thunder went away with it, and really has barely been seen in comics since then. I think some version of some character using that name has appeared in the New 52 Earth 2 series somewhere, but not at all the same person. But, which is kind of a shame, because, as I've said before, Jonni was a strong female character, truly self-reliant, didn't even need any stupid superpowers, although she eventually did get one. And in that, she was kind of ahead of her time, which is somewhat ironic for such an old soul who venerates PIs of the 1930s. And the only question I have to ask here at the end of this discussion of her first appearance is, when is Brian Michael Bendis, who is now working for DC, going to get his hands on Jonni Thunder and bring her back to the forefront? Because she is exactly the kind of character that Bendis loves to write. So, somebody put a bug in that man's ear. We need Jonni Thunder back in the contemporary mainstream DC universe. Just doing what she does best, which is solve crimes and take names and take no nonsense from anybody. And that's the name of that tune. All right, forward to yesteryear. Let's proceed from Jonni Thunder to an even earlier DC sampling. From my birth year, 1979, an early issue of one of my very favorite series, DC Comics Presents number 8, featuring Superman and Swamp Thing. Now, I know to which conclusion some of you are currently jumping, and let me hasten to correct you. I'm not talking here about The Jungle Line by Alan Moore and Rick Veitch. That Superman Swamp Thing story didn't run until much later, DCCP number 85. Here we're talking about DCCP number 8. Much earlier and much different soupy, swampy soiree. In fact, as far as I know, it's the first ever meeting between these two characters. It carries a cover date of April 1979, which converts to an actual sale date, if I can go by what I find on the Direct Currents page inside this issue, of the week of January 8th, 1979. That's a week after I was born. You see, I was born on a Monday in January of 1979, just like Solomon Grundy. And hey, by no coincidence at all, Solomon Grundy also happens to be an important character in this issue of DC Comics Presents. Eat your heart out, Ian Levinstein. I can make with the segues too sometimes. So, yes, Superman, Swamp Thing, and Solomon Grundy. It's a big old Bronze Age swamp creature slamma-jamma. The front cover proclaims, "Watch out! Lock your doors! Bolt your windows! The marshland monsters are coming!" And the scene, a cover image drawn by Jose Luis Garcia Lopez, I might throw in, depicts Superman being held in an arm lock from behind by Swamp Thing, while Solomon Grundy winds up for a death blow on the other side of him, and Superman is saying, "You've always been on the side of good, Swamp Thing, so why are you helping Solomon Grundy destroy me?" The answer to that question is, pretty simply, Swamp Thing is not helping Solomon Grundy destroy Superman. He's helping Solomon Grundy escape from Superman, for reasons which will become plain in a moment. Oh, so this story was written by Steve Englehart, with art by Murphy Anderson. That's both pencils and inks, incidentally. And it's just Anderson without the swan half of the famous Swanderson duo. This is Anderson inking himself. He's actually best known, I think, to latter-day fandom as an inker, particularly over Kurt Swan's pencils. But he could also pencil in his own right. Did quite a bit of it back in the Silver Age. And he's doing it again here in late 1978, shall we say. Not his best work, however. I'm inclined to opine, and a few more details on that a little bit later on also. But yes. So, the story is entitled The 60 Deaths of Solomon Grundy. And from my perspective, it's actually most interesting as a Grundy story, more so than either a Superman or a Swamp Thing story. And certainly more interesting as a Grundy story than as a Superman-Swamp Thing team-up story, because it's actually not that at all. Superman and Swamp Thing never work together in this story. They really only interact with each other in just one scene early on in the story, and that interaction is really more agonistic than cooperative, so not a team-up at all, and Solomon Grundy is really the catalyst for pretty much everything. And it's interesting to me, in particular, as a Solomon Grundy story, because the Grundy that we see in DC Comics Presents number 8 is explicitly the Earth 1 pre-crisis Solomon Grundy. Because, hey, there was such a thing. We're not talking about the Earth 2 Solomon Grundy, the original who fought Alan Scott Green Lantern back in the 40s and battled both Green Lantern and other Justice Society members over the years since then. It's also not some continuity ambiguous Earth B invention, the likes of which occurred quite often in Bob Haney's run on The Brave and the Bold and stories like this. No, this is a DC Comics Presents story in 1979 yet, when continuity mattered to more DC Comics staffers than it didn't. So we're told quite plainly, in a Superman thought bubble, he, in the middle of getting pummeled by Solomon Grundy, he finds time to think to himself, the Solomon Grundy of Earth 2 was an easy match for me, but this new Grundy of Earth 1 is powerful enough to carry out his threat. That threat being, Grundy kill. So what Superman is telling us here is that this is an Earth 1 Grundy, distinct from the JSA opponent, and he's actually more powerful than the original Earth 2 Grundy, powerful enough to actually harm or kill Superman. And that was news to me. I hadn't realized that there was an Earth 1 Solomon Grundy. He wasn't a big part of the DC Universe for very long, although he did have a run of stories in the Superman comics of the very late 70s. Roughly coinciding with the introduction of the Incredible Hulk to television. Not at all coincidentally, I would have to say. The Earth 1 Grundy was introduced, I've discovered, in Superman number 319, cover dated January of 78, so a little over a year before the story I'm talking about here. And in story, the Earth 1 Grundy was created in the laboratory of Superman's enemy, not Luthor, as I'm sure you might expect, but the Parasite, another one of Superman's enemies with scientific leanings. And Parasite just grew this new Earth 1 Grundy from cuttings, I guess you might say, since Grundy is a plant-based creature, taken from the Earth 2 Grundy during a visit that he made to Earth 1. And so he grew his own native Earth 1 Grundy. So this Grundy, to continue in botanical terms, is something of an invasive species, since the cultivar was taken from another universe. So this Grundy was considerably more powerful, and, to put it where it's at, the Earth 1 Grundy came into being pretty much as just a cheap, sly means of sneaking the Hulk into Superman's rogues gallery. Because there are certain similarities between Grundy and the Hulk in power levels, in appearance, in behavior. For a little while there in the Bronze Age, nowadays we tend to think of Grundy mostly either as a JSA opponent or even a member of Batman's rogues gallery. But in the very late Bronze Age, the Earth 1 Grundy was a frequent foe of Superman. And that's what we're up against here. He's explicitly said to equal or trump Superman in strength. Although his bestiality makes him somewhat easy to outwit, at least. So that's Superman's out in his battles with Earth 1 Grundy. And as the title of this story suggests, The 60 Deaths of Solomon Grundy, Grundy's ability to regenerate after seemingly lethal damage is established as his power set fairly early on. In fact, prior to this story, since mention is made, unfortunately without one of those nifty little editorial footnotes to tell you exactly when it happened, that Grundy had been killed and grew back before this, sometime in the year between when he made his first appearance in Superman number 319 and this story. This is chalked up to something called Slaughter Swamp Blight, which would appear to be some kind of biochemical condition in the sewer water underneath Metropolis that allows Grundy to regrow himself from whatever, like, microflora happen to exist in that water, and grow himself back into being, with his memories and personality pretty much intact, always clothed peculiarly. It's interesting that Solomon Grundy would regrow himself with the same gray shirt, black jacket, tattered trousers, and brown shoes every time. One would, I guess if you're going for a no prize, or a baldy, as such things were called in the Superman comics of the post-crisis era, if you wanted to explain this, perhaps the clothing that Solomon Grundy covered himself with when he first appeared back in the 40s, stolen from some escaped criminals he encountered in Slaughter Swamp, might have merged at the or fused at the genetic level with his body, in much the same way that all that swamp life had accreted itself to the murdered body of Cyrus Gold to create Grundy in the first place, so that now it's part of his integumentary system, and it just regrows itself as naturally as his skin would. I've just impressed myself. So, anyway, we do see Grundy growing himself back in this issue. In fact, multiple times, because at the beginning of the story we see just the one Grundy, but it quickly becomes apparent that the Slaughter Swamp Blight is making it possible for Grundy to regenerate himself even before his previous body has died. So we end up with 60 super powerful Earth 1 Grundys briefly running around Metropolis near the end of this story. And so this is it's the introduction of an idea, I would say, that a concept that was seized upon and advanced still further by James Robinson about 25 years later in his Starman run, when he made Grundy a supporting character there, and introduced the notion that Grundy did indeed regenerate himself every time he seemed to die in battle with superheroes, and he undergoes subtle changes every time he does that. I mean, even in this story back in 1978 or 79, Grundy says aloud, boastfully, that he's aware of his own regenerations. He says, "I go away, come back, but each time stronger." So he knows that he can regenerate, and there are little differences in his makeup every time he does regenerate. Robinson, though, his idea of the differences between incarnations of Grundy was more a matter of personality than power. Like, sometimes Grundy's a totally mindless beast, sometimes he's cunning and clever, sometimes he just stomps around reciting the same line of a nursery rhyme over and over again. Solomon Grundy, born on a Monday, a 19th century nursery rhyme from which Grundy took his name in the first place. And every once in a while he's even benevolent, as seen in the Starman run, when one incarnation of Grundy actually became a friend of Jack Knight and part of his super social circle. So you can say that a case could be made that that element of James Robinson's use of Solomon Grundy has its roots back here in this period of Grundy stories. Now, as to the two headliners of this issue, Superman and Swamp Thing. Well, let's just say about Swamp Thing that he was in a bit of a limbo period at this point. He had reached kind of a low in his ongoing saga of Swamp Thing, if you will, figuratively speaking, not literally. His original early 70s series had ended in the fall of 76, a couple of years earlier. He had then gone on to be the supporting character in the Challengers of the Unknown ongoing comic for about a year's worth of that title. Since it was bi-monthly, that amounts to 6 issues. And that ended up roughly a year before this comic saw print. So, yeah, Swamp Thing was something of a rarity in the DC Universe at the very end of the 70s and into the early 80s. I think he only made one more comic book appearance in an issue of Brave and the Bold after this before the comic actually entitled Saga of the Swamp Thing got its start in 1982. So we're right in the middle of a kind of a fallow period for Swamp Thing stories. So him showing up at all is something of an occasion. I should also point out here at the outset that this is definitely a pre-The Anatomy lesson Swamp Thing. So this is a Swamp Thing who still believes himself to be a plant creature that used to be a man, as opposed to just a plant creature based on a man. And it's also before Swamp Thing knew anything about the green, that mystical energy field that surrounds, penetrates, and binds the plant kingdom together. And then before he was aware that such a thing existed and could also be pointed to as a source of a link or connection between him and Solomon Grundy, a character with whom Swamp Thing is also making his first brush in this issue. It's not only the first meeting between Superman and Swamp Thing, but the first meeting between Swamp Thing and Solomon Grundy, his fellow plant-based muck monster. And it would not be the last such encounter either. So anyway, as to the story, since, as I've said, Swamp Thing doesn't really know his true elemental nature yet, at the very beginning of 1979, his primary motivation is still to wander the Earth, just trying to survive and hoping to find a cure for himself, to get himself back to the human being that he thinks he used to be. And for that reason, he ends up in Metropolis, because he heard through the underground grapevine, I guess, that Solomon Grundy, a swamp creature, much like himself, apparently, had several encounters with Superman in Metropolis, and he finds his way to Metropolis in the hopes of getting an opportunity to study Grundy, hoping to maybe find a cure for himself through this examination. And he lucks into finding Grundy in the Metropolis sewer, but there his luck runs out because Superman pops down into the sewer and finds Grundy at exactly the same moment. Superman intends to take Grundy into custody. Swamp Thing can't allow that to happen, and that's what leads to the scene that I described on the front cover. Swamp Thing getting Superman in a hammerlock while Grundy takes advantage. And inside the comic, in the actual story, Grundy slams his fists together on either side of Superman's head, and that is enough to knock Superman unconscious. And this is the pre-crisis planet-juggling Superman we're talking about here, so you give you an idea of what kind of power level Grundy has. As I mentioned before, Grundy's basically, Earth 1 Grundy is basically supposed to be an analog for the Hulk, DC Universe Hulk, so that we can have an answer to the question, who would win in a fight between Superman and the Hulk without having to go through all the messy copyright and trademark issues that such a battle would otherwise entail. So Grundy and Swamp Thing are able to make a quick getaway, and when Superman comes to, he remarks to himself in a thought bubble, "Great row, I'm lucky to still be in one piece. This time it's kill or be killed for Solomon Grundy, and maybe the Swamp Thing, too." So, yeah, Superman is not messing around here. He's kind of got murder on his mind when it comes to Grundy, which is somewhat justifiable, but not entirely, as becomes more apparent a little bit later in the story. We'll get back to that. As for Superman's attitude towards Swamp Thing, when Swamp Thing first appears in the sewer and accosts Superman to keep him from taking Grundy into custody, Superman thinks to himself, he must be hiding down here, the poor creature. Interpol says he's dangerous, but the Batman tells me different, and Bruce's word is good enough for me. I hope I can get through to him. So there you go. That's a pretty good hint that this is the first time that Superman and Swamp Thing have ever met, although, obviously Batman and Swamp Thing have in The Brave and the Bold. And so that's Superman is willing to give Swamp Thing the benefit of the doubt there, but after how Swamp Thing behaves in this scene, Superman's not so sure anymore. So Superman just recovers for a bit. Meanwhile, Swamp Thing and Grundy are repairing to Swamp Thing's makeshift lab down in the Metropolis sewers. And kind of a tentative and very uneasy alliance, a friendship in Grundy's view, although his definition of friendship is about as warped as Grundy's definition of everything else. But between Swamp Thing and Grundy. In Grundy's own words, "You are not man. You are different like Grundy. You help Grundy. Grundy will come." And I notice I'm not using a southern accent. That's the Earth Super Friends Grundy. Possibly the Earth 2 Grundy spoke that way too. I can't be sure. But anyway, just take my word for it. Earth 1 Grundy sounds like that. So Swamp Thing hopes to study Grundy. He actually... the friendship between Grundy and Swamp Thing would almost be touching if it weren't so eerie and tense, because Grundy is quite obviously a powder keg, and Swamp Thing is not quite as much like him as he thinks. So, the reader is kind of kept on tenterhooks during the interaction between these two swamp monsters. At one point, Swamp Thing produces a scalpel and tries to take a skin sample from Grundy, and Grundy says, "Cut Grundy? You want to cut Grundy? Grundy will kill!" But then he hesitates for a moment and thinks better of it and says, "No, you are friend. You and Grundy are different together. Can't kill friend." It's, like I said, it would almost be touching if it weren't so suspenseful and dangerous. But still, Swamp Thing manages to get the sample he needs and proceeds with his tests. Meanwhile, Superman is up topside, visiting with his go-to science advisor at the time, Dr. Jeanette Clyburn, director of the Metropolis branch of Star Labs, who is promising to work out some kind of miracle herbicide that he can use against Grundy. And then Lois shows up. I was talking earlier about what Swamp Thing's status quo was in the broader DC universe at this time. Well, Superman and Lois are pretty obviously and publicly an item right now. They are clearly dating. At the bottom of page 10 in this story, they actually share a kiss. So I think we have the Christopher Reeve 1978 Superman film to thank for this. Kind of encourages DC... if it didn't make it seem like an outright necessity to DC, to make Superman and Lois's romance a continuing plot point in Superman's monthly adventures in all of his series. So we get Lois showing up at Star Labs and for a heavy date with Superman, although the fact that Superman's costume still smells like sewer water kind of kills the mood a bit. Superman promises her that he will, quote, "fly through the sun to dry clean myself." Pre-crisis Superman. I do miss you. But yeah, so that's kind of where Superman's at, or at least in terms of his love life. Shortly after that, a report reaches Superman's super ears of a Grundy rampaging around on the surface, which is kind of news to the Grundy that Swamp Thing has met, because the two of them are still down below in the sewers, where Swamp Thing has just figured out that Grundy is not truly alive, and therefore is of no use to Swamp Thing in his ongoing pursuit of a cure for himself. Superman is also aware of Grundy's status as a form of unique non-life, although he's not really straining that vaunted super brain of his to understand or define that non-life beyond labeling it, quote, "distorted weirdness." Not exactly very open-minded of him. He's just saying, Grundy's not really alive. I guess I'll just treat him like a super robot and destroy him. So that's what Superman has in mind. And sure enough, this duplicate Grundy that he meets topside, he's actually able to kill by just flying out into orbit and coming right back down at super speed and delivering a double haymaker right to Grundy's chin, and Grundy goes down and doesn't get back up again. So there's an answer to whether Superman could in fact defeat the DC Universe analog of the Hulk. He can, and not only that, he has to do it multiple times in the course of this issue. Because soon enough, as I mentioned earlier, that pesky Slaughter Swamp Blight starts generating dozens of Grundys. 5 dozens of Grundys, to be precise, throughout Metropolis, including the one that Swamp Thing was testing, who hears from a transistor radio carried by a pedestrian walking by a manhole cover above his and Swamp Thing's heads that Superman has defeated Solomon Grundy up top. This sends Grundy into a rage, and he climbs back up out of the sewer, swatting Swamp Thing aside in the process. I guess the friendship is over. And Superman then finds himself with the unenviable task of defeating 60 Solomon Grundys with near Hulk-level strength. But as it turns out, doing so is super easy, barely an inconvenience, because at just the right moment, Dr. Clyburn shows up with the magic science cylinder containing whatever magic bullet solution she's concocted to solve the Grundy infestation. So, in the course of 1.2 pages, Superman gets out there and just flies all around Metropolis at super speed and basically just touches this herbicidal compound, whatever it is, to all the different Grundys he meets. And they all drop dead instantly. Meanwhile, Swamp Thing he overhears Superman's conversation with Dr. Clyburn, and he thinks to himself, "What? No! Don't destroy them. Cage them. Put them on another planet, but don't snuff them out. They're not alive as we know life. But something stirs them. Have to stop him. Stop Superman. Not even a monster wants to die." So, yeah, this last page magic bullet resolution to the story is, I mean, it's hurried and contrived for one thing, but it's also pretty inhumane. I mean, I'm a little disappointed in the writing of Superman here, that he wouldn't at least consider, even if Grundy's not technically alive in the strictest biological definition, but he's sentient, so that really ought to count for something. I mean, at least Swamp Thing is a bit more sympathetic and does his best to stop Superman, but he doesn't move very quickly and he can't speak very well, so unfortunately he tries to run up to Superman and yell to him to stop, but too slow, too silent. He has to just stand there, watching helplessly as Superman exterminates the Grundy menace. So, that's kind of that. Superman saves the day once again, and little realizing, at what possible cost to his own humanity. And Swamp Thing, meanwhile, having a very different understanding of humanity than Superman does, is left to do nothing but shamble back into the sewers to continue his endless wandering. While Superman thinks, perhaps poor Swamp Thing, maybe I can find some way to help him someday. But not this day. Further remark or two. Well, I said I would say a little bit more about Murphy Anderson's artwork, and probably not his strongest. This is the second and I believe last issue of DC Comics Presents that Murphy Anderson illustrated. He had done an Aquaman story in number 5, which I thought turned out better than this one. For one thing, his clean, Silver Agey type style really isn't that suitable to, monster, gothic horror type stories of the 1970s. There's none of the mood and atmosphere, none of the chiaroscuro shadow effects. It's not the kind of Swamp Thing story that fans of the character have by now come to expect. I mean, it's not Bernie Wrightson, it's not Totleben or Bizet or Veitch or any of those guys. So even the sewer scenes are very brightly lit. So that's a little disappointing. But beyond that, there's even a few problems with the layouts of the pages. I mean, as I said, he's better known as an inker than a penciler, and by 1979 he had been doing a lot more inking than penciling in his recent career. There's a scene in the part of that little altercation between Superman, Swamp Thing, and Grundy near the beginning of the story, on page 5, when Superman actually rips Swamp Thing's arm off. It takes place in the smallest panel on the page. I darn near missed that it happened, until I noticed a couple panels later that, oh wait, Swamp Thing's arm isn't there anymore. So that's a case of Anderson kind of burying the lead on that particular page. So, yeah, that's it. Not the best work Murphy Anderson ever turned in. If you read the letters page to DCCP number 8, one response to one of the letters about the artistic consistency or lack thereof on DC Comics Presents, it triggers kind of an extended response belaboring an airplane metaphor. There's nothing worse than belaboring an airplane metaphor than belaboring a time machine metaphor, let me tell you, folks. But anyway, the reply is, I think the letter writer expressed a desire to see Jose Luis Garcia Lopez become the regular artist on DCCP. And the editorial reply is, "We're glad you dig on the high-flying art of Lopez, but we're expecting to soar to even greater altitudes with artistic ace Murphy Anderson in the cockpit. Murph's racked up a lot of flying time with Supes as longtime inker of Superman some years back, and we anticipate that his experience will permit him to become the definitive pilot of this magazine's visuals, either flying solo, as in this issue's story, or with a navigator like Joe Staton, who has supplied the layouts for next issue's Superman-Wonder Woman team-up in DC Comics Presents number 9. That story in DCCP number 9... I'm pretty sure did not actually feature any Murphy Anderson art. It was just credited to Staton. And sure enough, Anderson did not become the regular penciler of this title. He just... pretty much one issue and out. He did not become the regular pilot for this series. So I'm not sure whether that had something to do with Murphy Anderson's own personal life, or whether there was some dissatisfaction with the work he turned in this issue, number 8. But whatever the reason, DCCP continued on without a regular penciler, and pretty much never acquired a regular penciler. It wasn't exactly common among DC series of the Bronze Age to have regular creative teams on either writing or art, so it's not really that surprising. But it is a little bit surprising when the editor comes onto the letters page and announces, hey, this guy is going to be the regular penciler, and one issue later that proves no longer to be the case. I'd probably know a little bit more about this situation if I had gotten around to reading the DC Explosion oral history published by Tomorrow's a little while ago. This is the sort of thing that our friend and frequent consultant Eric Nolan Wethington probably knows a thing or two about, because his knowledge of behind-the-scenes information about comic book creators is darn near second to none. So if you know anything about Murphy Anderson and this stage of his career, Eric, I'd appreciate your input. So there you go, an interesting little moment in the history of Swamp Thing, and even more interesting history in one of the oldest antagonists in DC history, Solomon Grundy. Oh, and a final note, this issue is dedicated on the final page for Len, Bernie, and Joe. And I think you can probably dope out which Len, Bernie, and Joe that is, but it's the creators of Swamp Thing. And it's also kind of an indication of how rare Swamp Thing stories had become in early 1979, that any time the character shambled across a printed page, it needs to be dedicated to its creators, because you never knew when a Swamp Thing appearance was going to be its last in those days. This is well before Alan Moore came along and revolutionized the character. Okay, I think we're ready to return to the subjective present of my review queue, i.e. late 2001, so full neutrinos ahead to return to that point in time to talk about a special comic book project featuring one of my very favorite characters. This is the first issue of a Nightcrawler miniseries. First issue cover dated February of 2002, so probably released December of 2001. This Nightcrawler mini was part of a series of Marvel character-focused solo miniseries that Marvel was doing at the time, called Marvel Icons. Many of these miniseries featured X-Men characters. Nightcrawler was one such beneficiary of this, as were characters like Iceman, Rogue, and Cyclops. Now, the Marvel Icons series, it did make for a great convenient showcase and/or test lab for a new, unproven creative talent. Because one imagines that these popular characters had a built-in fan base, and many readers would probably just pick them up for the character involved, regardless of who was actually creating the story. And actually, Marvel didn't really use the Marvel Icons line in that capacity all that much. Many of these miniseries were created by more or less established talent. In fact, a handful of them were written by a young no-account named Brian K. Vaughan, who was not exactly an unknown back in 2001. He had something of a reputation as a comics writer, but he was not the multimedia juggernaut that he has become since then. But in the case of the Marvel Icons Nightcrawler miniseries, that is pretty much what Marvel did. Use it as a tryout book for a new young writer. Now, the art is provided by slightly better-known creators. The penciler is named Matthew Smith. Not that Matthew Smith, of course. I assure you, he wields a stylus, not a sonic screwdriver, who had a couple of credits to his name. He's the one who drew that DC Day of Judgment miniseries event that introduced the comics world to Hal Jordan as the Spectre. He also drew a few issues of Sandman Mystery Theater for Vertigo, among other assignments, so he was somewhat known. And the inker was Mark Morales, who is, as inkers go, is actually pretty well known, I believe. But the writer is someone named Chris Kapiniak. And barring some fairly obscure, small, or vanity press stuff he might have done earlier, this is the first comic book of any mainstream importance that Chris Kapiniak ever had published. So this is his his Marvel debut. So he gets to do it on one of my favorite X-Men characters. For a time, he was my favorite character in all of comics. He remains my favorite X-Men character to this very day. Always enjoyed his cavalier, devil-may-care attitude, his free spirit, his joie de vivre, his swashbuckling attitude, his extreme agility and cool power set and neat appearance, and his German heritage, because, I do come from Pennsylvania Dutch country, where almost everybody is of German ancestry, and it's always kind of nice to see someone non-villainous of German descent pop up in comics. So I had all these reasons to appreciate Mr. Kurt Wagner. And one of the very first comics back issue series, I should say, that I ever sought out and found after becoming a collector in the early 90s was the first Nightcrawler miniseries, written and drawn by Nightcrawler's creator, Dave Cockrum, in 1985. That miniseries was a great deal of fun. I'm afraid that the second Nightcrawler miniseries to see print from Marvel, is kind of anything but that. The difference between the two is somewhat literally night and day, because, for one thing, the tone is radically different, diametrically different, and for another, literally, whereas the first Nightcrawler miniseries took place at least partly in the sunshine, this one is pretty much a nocturnal affair. Makes a certain amount of sense for a character called Nightcrawler, I suppose, but still, just not the mood I would have gone with. So anyway, the first issue of this miniseries is entitled Passion Play, Part 1, Rising Dark. And the story is not quite as bad as that title might lead some of you to think, but in my opinion, it's not as good as it should have been. So this miniseries is a tale taken from Kurt Wagner's time training for the priesthood. Nightcrawler's Catholic faith instilled in him during his time as a wanderer in the south of Germany as a boy. Always been fairly important to him, and it's something that I've thought always did him credit. But his time as a priest in training, it's not my favorite time in his life, and I know that there are other Nightcrawler and X-Men fans who think even less highly of it than I do. It's a development in Nightcrawler's personal timeline that was later eliminated from his backstory, actually, via flimsy retcon. A retcon that was made palatable only by the fact that it was eliminating a bunch of even flimsier writing that preceded it. What I'm understanding here is that the writers who explored the priesthood angle seem to know little about the rigors of actual Catholic ordination. And so the depiction of said ordination was never especially true to life in the comics, and that was kind of picked up on by those creators who finally decided, we're going to dismiss this as an induced hallucination, something that Nightcrawler was made to believe he was going through by a bunch of bad guys, but he actually wasn't. Yeah, the reasoning behind all of that is a little bit, to use the word a third time, flimsy. But anyway, that's... what was done was done. Nightcrawler was shown to be training for the priesthood and was later revealed not to have been doing that at all. But this miniseries is set during the time when this was believed by all concerned to be the reality of Nightcrawler's situation. He was training to be a priest. Kurt's mentor, Father Whitney, is an important supporting character in this miniseries. He's Kurt's confidant, sounding board, and dispenser of unhelpful answers to agonizing moral questions that Kurt must confront as the story unfolds. So, the big bad, as it were, of this series is a big and a bad indeed. It's actually so big and so bad that it's not even a person, it's a practice. One of the very oldest and worst sins of humankind, to wit, slavery. It's presented here in its modern form as human trafficking, although writer Kopiniak makes a fairly liberal use of terms like slave and owner to refer to the victims and practitioners of this ancient yet contemporary evil. Nightcrawler gets himself involved with modern-day slavery on American soil when he runs across a young Thai woman who had been working as an involuntary domestic servant in the home of a well-to-do family, also of Thai descent. Her situation was she had been promised passage to the United States and guaranteed employment when she arrived here. And she actually paid for the privilege of being boated over here in secret, smuggled in essence. And once she got here, she was plunked down in the home of this well-to-do family and forced to do menial household labor. I mean, it's not as if they clapped her in irons or anything like that, but she had the knowledge all along that if she complained about her circumstances or tried to run away or anything like that, she was very likely to be arrested and deported almost immediately. So there she was, doing this horrible job for no pay. She finally couldn't take it anymore and took the risk and broke away from her owner, the lady of the house, who went out shopping in public with the Thai servant girl in tow. And she happened to run into a Thai restaurant. She saw the sign in her language, ran in there, and it just so happened that Kurt Wagner and Father Whitney were in there having dinner, and she kind of claimed sanctuary from them. And so she was taken back to Father Whitney's church, where she was kind of kept there in secret. A waiter from the Thai restaurant came along to act as interpreter. And so Kurt Wagner finds himself in this uncomfortable position, having met this woman and realized, having been made aware of this trafficking problem that exists in the United States in the 21st century. He immediately makes it his personal one-mutant 4-issue crusade, to seek retribution for this woman's plight, to try to bring an end to this widespread practice that has brought her so much suffering, and that continues to bring suffering to people like her who come to the United States from all over. So this becomes his somewhat masochistic motivation for this miniseries, to combat slave trafficking. Of course, the glaring question there is, how? I mean, slavery is not a supervillain. There's not much of an easy answer to this problem, certainly not for one person, even if he is a superpowered mutant with a great deal of idealistic force behind his resolve to solve said problem. The miniseries goes some way to solving the problem of this invisible, intangible foe, by providing a personification thereof. We're introduced in the first issue to a brutal Russian mobster who is sort of an overboss of this slave smuggling. He's the head of one particular smuggling ring, and he's a very evil person. We know that because the writer shows him breaking the neck of one of his smuggling boat captains just because some of the merchandise, quote-unquote, the human merchandise on board his ship didn't have proper paperwork, and that delayed the ship in port. It wasn't even the captain's fault, but that doesn't matter to the smuggler because he's evil, and so he breaks the captain's neck just to make sure that we, the reader, understand exactly how evil this person is. And so, of course, in the end, by the time the miniseries has run its course, Nightcrawler will have scored a symbolic moral victory against this one person, but will have fallen far short of actually doing away with this millennia-old problem of humankind. But Kurt is still in there trying. He dutifully asks himself all kinds of what would Jesus do type questions, drawing parallels between himself and Christ to help keep his motivations direct and pure as he sets out on this quixotic personal quest to try and find redress for this poor Thai woman and for all the others who have shared her fate. And the sheer hopelessness and ethical complexity of the situation just drags the story right down into the cistern of despair, and it does not make for a very enjoyable reading experience. In fact, the melodrama and the high-flown topicality of the whole thing kind of makes it read like a network TV movie of the week, or if you prefer a more contemporary analogy, like a Lifetime Network original movie. I do have to give Chris Kopiniak some points for risk-taking, for the unusual direction for this character. I can't, little as I care for seeing Nightcrawler in this kind of position, I can't honestly say that I can't picture Chris Claremont himself tackling a story like this using Nightcrawler, although Claremont's version, I'm imagining, would make use of more captions and dialogue and thought balloons. And also more skill. Yeah, I don't mean to malign Chris Kopiniak. The miniseries is not that badly written. It's just the whole premise, I think, is somewhat flawed. It's not the best match in my mind for the character. He took a bit of a risk, but I think trying to tell this kind of story with a character who is known as a smiling, swashbuckling hero is probably doomed to fail, or at least doomed to depress. And the artwork, just to share the blame around here, probably wasn't helping that much. Matthew Smith's style is kind of visually bleak and bland, which is a good fit for the tone of the story, don't get me wrong, but since I don't like the tone of the story to begin with, the appropriate artwork only cements in my mind what I don't like about it. Yeah, his pencils here, they kind of look like a lot of generic small press pencil work that I've seen, or like weak Vertigo house style, which makes sense because Matthew Smith has done Vertigo work. And the inks from Mark Morales and the color work by our friend Brian Miller in his Hi-Fi Studios, they don't improve the situation. Rather, they impart to the pencil work kind of an incomplete and incongruous splashiness that actually makes the art look worse. It's the art. Nothing really clicks with the art. The different elements form something that's a little bit less than the sum of its parts. So you're getting the idea that I didn't really care for this miniseries that much, which is a shame because I love the character, but this mini was not to my taste, as I suspect it would also not be to the taste of many other Nightcrawler fans. Too much soul-searching and three-fingered hand-wringing, and not enough swashbuckling. So if you are a Nightcrawler fan and you're looking for some older material featuring the character in solo action to enjoy, go back and find that 1985 Dave Cockrum miniseries, or try the Nightcrawler solo series done in the mid-2000s, circa 2004, I think, written by Roberto Aguirre Sacasa, which I will be getting to and discussing on this time bubble at some future time. You may be sure of it. But yeah, this miniseries from 2001-2002, I cannot in good conscience recommend it. It is a bit of a downer, and if you're not in favor of Nightcrawler being illusorily ordained as a priest, this miniseries is kind of a reminder of that phase in his life as well. So, not a good time for all. All right, one more to go here, folks, before the tiny bubble lightning round. And for the final full-length review of this installment, in the interest of smaller publisher representation, I've decided to talk to you a little bit about a Chaos comic. That's right, something from Brian Pulido's little House of Horrors. I have bought very few Chaos comics in the course of my time as a collector. It's just the stuff they tended to publish, your Lady Death and Evil Ernie type stuff, tended not to appeal to me all that much. It's a lot of gore and a lot of titillation, and just wasn't usually my cup of tea. So what was it that occasioned this rare dip into the Chaos cosmos in late 2001, you may be asking? 2 words, Time Bubble True Believers: Peter David. That's right. I have here the first issue of a 4-issue miniseries entitled The Haunted, which was written by PAD with pencils by one Nat Jones. Very Capullo-esque pencil work. More the Capullo of the time than the Capullo of the present day. It's more like Spawn Capullo than Batman Capullo. Inks by Kevin Conrad and Rich Bonk. The Haunted is a tale of 4 tormented teenagers. It's on one level a story about the social horrors of high school, and on another level, somewhat metaphorical or figuratively evocative of the first level, you might say. There are certain parallels between them. More paranormal horrors that occur in these teenagers' lives as they discover that they have some kind of superpowers, and that there's some kind of mysterious connection between the 4 of them, and that these powers are not only making their everyday lives more difficult, they're also, as a result, leading to them being hunted down by a mysterious organization known as the Grey Cell, who presumably, you may presume, and you'll be correct in so doing, that the Grey Cell had something to do with these kids having their powers in the first place. Their origin isn't really explained in the first issue, but we are at least introduced to the 4 characters to start with. And they are as follows. We've got Celia Thorne, who is a cheerleader, who has the ability to manifest her emotional state in ways that influence the surrounding environment. Like, for example, if she's sad and weeping, then a gray thundercloud appears overhead and pours rain down just on the few square feet of ground around where she's sitting. If she gets angry, around her is a place where you don't want to be. Then there's Cliff Cross, who is the quarterback of the football team. He's also kind of the de facto head of his household because his parents are worthless drunks. And his little sister, who, judging by the way she's drawn, can't be older than 13, is a cocaine addict. So he's the one who's responsible for all the cooking and laundry, just holding the household together. And he also has the ability to summon the specters of the deceased. So this is a power that we see him using in his first issue in an attempt to scare his smackhead little sister straight, by summoning the images of the moldering corpses of two other drug addicts of his acquaintance who are now dead. So he's a good guy, but he's got some very dark places in his psyche, which he goes for, to do wrong things for right reasons. Then we've got Kat Dinateo, who has got a reputation as the school slut, and she has kind of leaned hard into that reputation. She appears to live in an old custom van with a panther painted on the side of it, and the vanity plate Bad Kitty. And when we first see her, she is shacked up inside of said van with the unfaithful tomcat boyfriend of Celia Thorne, the cheerleader. And in the course of this rendezvous, we get the sense that Kat Dinateo may be something of a lycanthrope and may have the ability to transform into a more literal cat, with slit-pupiled yellow eyes and clawed fingertips with which she accidentally lacerates the back of the unfaithful boyfriend with whom she's doing the deed in the van. And then there's the fourth character, who is kind of our POV for the introduction to all the other characters. Her name is Desiree Bricker, and she, although she doesn't know it yet, has the ability to astral project. She falls asleep one night, and her spirit leaves her body, and she assumes she's dreaming and just walks around and observes all this weird stuff the other main characters making use of or discovering their powers. And in the course of this, she feels her spirit self start to dissipate, and she's confronted by a mysterious figure who says, "Go back to your body before you die," and so that's kind of her rude awakening there. So there are the four characters. They fit pretty neatly into some high school melodrama stock character roles. You got the cheerleader, the jock, the slut, and I'm not sure what label to assign to Desiree. I don't speak Breakfast Club fluently. Angry young black woman is about the best I can come up with for her, because she does kind of have a temper problem. We're told that her father died when she was young, and she was the sergeant-at-arms for the student council, and when she forcibly ejected the school principal when he trespassed in a closed meeting, she got on his bad side, and also the student council chose to expel her from the group. So all of these people have got their own personal darkness, their little things that set them apart, even the cheerleader. And the story in this first issue is kind of this well-woven by writer Peter David, an ever-tightening web of weirdness that is closing around these four high school stock characters, who are made so much more than that by the just the sharp and effervescent dialogue of Peter David. So these four characters find themselves being inexorably drawn together as they confront the everyday problems of high school. They then have to confront the anything but everyday problems of being stalked by representatives of this mysterious gray cell. In fact, they are all but dead in the water. The gray cell corners the four of them at the side of the road. But then their last-minute rescue comes from the mysterious figure who told Desiree to wake up and go back to her body before she dissipates. He looks like a street person. He's wearing a raggedy outfit and a long hooded trench coat, and he introduces himself to them as Stitch. Yes, and any similarity in name or appearance to Frank Miller's Stick character, a mysterious mentor for Daredevil, is probably anything but coincidental, if we're all being honest with ourselves here. And I'm sure Peter David would make no bones about it either. But anyway, this Stitch person uses paranormal powers of his own to somewhat horrifically deter the agents of the Gray Cell, and basically tells these 4 kids, come with me and if you want to live. And so answers to the questions, so how did these kids get their powers, what's the connection between them, what does the Gray Cell want with them, are forthcoming. And something that I was somewhat surprised, maybe I shouldn't have been, given my high respect for Peter David's writing, but I was somewhat surprised at how much I wanted to know the answers to these questions at the end of this first issue. I'm drawn in. And Peter David has taken these high school stock types in a situation that looks for all the world to me like a pitch for a primetime supernatural drama that the WB network passed on, and that ended up being a comic book instead, and it turned it into something that I actually wanted to continue reading. I am well drawn in. The artwork I mentioned has got that Capullo-esque flair from Nat Jones, and adding to this is kind of what we might call the Chaos Comics haunted house style. Visually, you can tell you're reading a Chaos comic because all the gutters of the story pages are black, as opposed to the more conventional white, and the speech bubbles are all black with white print inside, as opposed to, again, the more conventional white with black print. So, yeah, this is the rare Chaos comic that I have bought in my life, and I do not regret having done so. It's also somewhat lesser-known work of Peter David, so any fans of the man and his work out there who may not have known about The Haunted, seek it out. It was a 4-issue miniseries, and there was at least one-shot following it entitled Gray Matters, which is almost certainly a reference to the Gray Cell, mysterious antagonists, and maybe giving us a little bit more background into who they are and what they're about and why they're after these 4 superpowered teens. So yeah, The Haunted. It's a nice little dive into the seamy, salacious, and scary world of high school psychodrama. Brought to you by a quality creative team and a slightly less high-quality publisher, Chaos. They don't exist anymore, so I don't see any need to refrain from bad-mouthing them. I didn't like most of their product, but I'm happy to find the occasional exception, and that is what I'm telling you about right now. And so our junket through time is almost at an end, so please prepare yourself for some re-entry turbulence in the form of a big volley of quick pops. Yes, I've got quite a pile of them to get through this time, as I did last time, so let's just turn on those afterburners and jump right in. All right, first of all, it occurs to me I didn't have any quote-unquote contemporary, meaning, of course, 2001-2002, DC comics to review in full in this episode, but I do have quite a few of them here to review in brief. The first of those, you remember the triangle numbers that used to appear on the Superman comics? They were intended to provide the optimal reading order for the, at times, weekly serialized Superman adventures across 3, 4, or even 5 different monthly Superman comics. You remember those? I do, and fairly fondly. Do you wonder when exactly they stopped doing that? Because I imagine most of us didn't really notice when they suddenly stopped appearing. But I can tell you with confidence that the final Superman comic to feature a regular triangle number on the front cover was Action Comics number 785, cover dated January of 2002, bearing the triangle number of 4 for 2002, a year that technically hadn't even begun yet at that point. And that triangle number appears in the upper corner of a beautiful Ed McGuinness Bizarro cover. Bizarro standing there, grinning insanely out at the reader, saying, "Me back!" And the story inside is pretty sweet, too. It's written by mad genius Joe Kelly, with artwork by Duncan Rouleau. It's a Bizarro story talking about Bizarro's misadventures. Well, at that time, he was under the sway of a villain calling himself General Zod. And he ended up in hell, of all places, Bizarro did. And the story is kind of his way of fighting his way back from the underworld. And the story is told in inverse order. It's kind of a backward story, very, very fitting for Bizarro. Even the individual page numbers are yeah, they're not only are they backwards, like page 2 has number 21 on it, page 3 has number 20, and so on, but the numbers themselves are mirror images. They're, not only are they on the... they appear on pages in the reverse order, but the numbers themselves are reversed, printed backwards. And the whole story is called Demento. As a nod to the movie Memento, which is also sort of told in a reverse story structure. Pretty clever stuff. And then I've got the next couple of Superman comics to appear after Action number 785. The first couple of Superman comics not to have triangle numbers. And just a quick aside, the triangle numbers did make brief reappearances years later as a kind of a navigational guide for readers for long but finite Superman crossover events. But they were never a regular feature of Superman comics on the covers after that issue that I just told you about. But the very next Superman comic to be published after that, without a triangle number, was Superman number 177 by Jeff Loeb and Ed McGuinness, which was not only the annual Metropolis mailbag issue, which was a Christmas-time tradition in the Superman books for a while there. Every Christmas, an issue of Superman will be published in which Superman has a little adventure, but sort of running parallel to that adventure would be a series of mail, or in this issue, email. The title of the story is Metropolis E-Mailbag, sent to the Man of Steel by members of the citizenry, sending him requests, messages of thanks, asking difficult questions that they seem to think Superman should be able to solve. And the little adventure that Superman goes on while mentally reviewing these merry missives involves a giant robot fight between Metallo and the new Toyman. Some of you probably forgot there was a new Toyman in the early 2000s, but there was. He was a 13-year-old Japanese youth named Hiro Okamura, who's the grandson of the Japanese scientist who invented the proprietary Metallo alloy, of which the villain Metallo's body was made, and after which he is named, we are told, in post-crisis continuity. So he... unlike his predecessor Winslow Schott, the original Toyman, this new 21st century Toyman, he's not so much into Cupid dolls and balls and jacks and yo-yos and such. He's got more of a penchant for building giant anime-inspired mechas. And one of the giant toys he sends against his opponent Metallo is a giant purple Pikachu. So yeah, this new Toyman is kind of an outgrowth of the early 2000s Japanese invasion, kind of a craze for the products of Japanese popular culture, things like Gundam and Pokemon included. Those are more the toys that this Toyman likes to use. And we'd later learn that he's not a strictly villainous Toyman either. He's more of a mercenary figure, but he actually aids Superman and Batman in stories that would be published not too long after this one. So, there we go, your introduction to the all-new Toyman. And we get to see him fight Metallo all at the same time. A fun story. And then after that, coming out the very next week, Superman the Man of Steel number 121, which was created by the guest team of Jeff Johns and Todd Nauck and Larry Stucker. This is actually the first full-length Superman story written by Jeff Johns ever to be published. Well before he ever became the regular writer of any of the monthly Superman books. He did this neat little fill-in story with art by Todd Young Justice Nauck. The story is called Diamonds and Steel, with apologies to the Joan Baez song Diamonds and Rust. And it's really more of a Royal Flush Gang story than it is a Superman story. See, not only is this the first ever Jeff Johns written full-length Superman tale, it's also the first story to dig into the idea of the Royal Flush Gang as a full-scale nationwide criminal organization, as opposed to just 5 bank robbers in playing card pajamas. It's told from the point of view of a somewhat low-ranking member of the Royal Flush Gang, telling about the time that this group to which she belongs actually took on and thwarted Superman, and how proud she is to be a member of that group. And this new take on the Royal Flush Gang would be parlayed into even greater use by other writers, including Gail Simone. Then we have something from Marvel, a 3-issue miniseries, Doom, The Emperor Returns, by Chuck Dixon and Leonardo Manco, further chronicling the reign of Victor Von Doom over Planet Doom, which is his typically megalomaniacal renaming of Counter-Earth, which is actually the Earth on which the Heroes Reborn titles of the mid to late 90s took place. Franklin Richards created it out of his own psyche as a haven for the fallen heroes who were seemingly blasted out of existence by Onslaught, and that's where they all went to live out funhouse mirror versions of their own lives drawn by former Image creators. And when that whole business ended up after about a year of real time, most of the Marvel heroes and villains who had occupied Heroes Reborn Earth, or Counter-Earth as it came to be known, returned to regular Earth. Dr. Doom, however, stayed behind and became Emperor of all he surveyed. And so this is another 3-issue story by Dixon and Manco about his rule there. Next, from America's Best Comics, I've got the first issue of Tom Strong's Terrific Tales, a spin-off of the main Tom Strong series, which contained, each issue was kind of an anthology of different shorter stories featuring not only Tom Strong, but other members of his supporting cast, and even one or two new characters here and there. The lead story is by Alan Moore, creator of Tom Strong, with art by Paul Revoche, whose lovely sort of sci-fi pulp-inspired artwork graced the covers of the Superman Return to Krypton crossover. I mentioned those on the Time Bubble several episodes ago, and he did the interior art for the lead story featuring Tom Strong, The Dark Inside. We've also got a Tesla Strong story starring Tom Strong's daughter, Wordless, written by Alan Moore, with art by Jaime Hernandez of Los Bros, about little Tesla going clubbing in outer space. A young Tom Strong story, Young Tom Strong and the Fiend of the Forgotten Shore, written by Steve Moore, no relation, with art by underrated Bronze Age great Alan Weiss. And finally, another story written by Steve Moore, with art by Arthur Adams. Woo, woo, woo. Tasty, tasty stuff. Featuring the introduction of Jonni Future, the niece of a former science fiction pulp writer, who Johnny discovers actually lived the adventures that he wrote about. In his alter ego of Jonni Future, Johnnny, Future, that is. This is Johnny, Jonni. That's the second Johnny with an I that I've talked about in this episode. It's talk about one of those peculiar synchronicities that the Time Bubble always manages to tease out. But yes, Jonni Future gets to travel to the year 5 billion AD and gets to team up with a humanoid leopard and discover the wonders of her uncle's secret headquarters in the mysterious future world of the Crepusculum, the twilight age of planet Earth. Beginning of something beautiful. So yeah, it's another great America's Best Comics publication. Swinging back to DC proper, I've got issue number 14 of the first ever Harley Quinn ongoing series. This is the one written by Carl Kiesel with art by Terry and Rachel Dodson. And in this issue, we see Harley Quinn striking out to begin a new chapter of her life, getting away from Mr. J and Gotham City and trying her luck in Metropolis. That's right, she heads out there on a motorcycle with Poison Ivy in tow, and when she gets there, she stumbles into a new life setting, a new secret identity, that of Holly Chance, a new job as a romance advice columnist for the Daily Planet. She even gets to reconnect with Jimmy Olsen, whom she met and briefly terrorized in the Harley Quinn Our Worlds at War one-shot, which I spotlighted on an earlier episode of the Time Bubble. So that's an important turning point for Harley in her first solo adventures back in late 2001. I've got issue number 145 of the Green Lantern series. This is still a part of the Judd Winnick and Dale Eaglesham run. And it's in this issue we see Kyle Rayner defeat his opponent Alexander Nero, who wields Sinestro-like yellow energies. So Kyle is able to definitively vanquish him, and in the process, he comes to an important personal resolution. After having a fateful meeting in the limbo of the spirit realm with Hal Jordan, the Spectre, to advise him what to do next with all this Green Lantern power he finds himself wielding. This is the issue in which Kyle finally makes the big life-changing decision to embrace all of the Green Lantern energy that resides within him, not just what he can channel through his ring. And he becomes, for the first time, Ion. And there were some major repercussions ramifying from that decision, let me tell you. Yeah, so that's the first appearance of Ion, who would later become known as one of the avatars of the various Lantern Corps. So that's a bit of a distant groundwork laid for that. I've got issue number 37 here of the Birds of Prey ongoing series, written by Chuck Dixon with pencils by Marcos Martin. And it's Ted Cord, the Blue Beetle, and Tim Drake Robin teaming up with Black Canary to defeat a couple of bad guys, including, this issue is most significant for me because it introduces to the DC Universe another character introduced in the early 90s Batman animated series, the Condiment King. Now, on that series, the Condiment King was just an identity temporarily assumed by a stand-up comedian who had been brainwashed by the Joker. Here, the Condiment King is not much more serious, but at least it's not just a temporary identity assumed against a person's will. Somebody actually voluntarily became the Condiment King in the DC Universe, we're told. In flashback, we learn that the Condiment King of the DC Universe proper, it was a disgruntled fast food employee named Mitchell Mayo, who was defeated in an early team-up adventure of Dick Grayson as Robin and Barbara Gordon as Batgirl. And jumping back to the future, to the present day of this story, the Condiment King is back, but in a bit of fallout from the recently concluded Last Laugh crossover. Yes, we're not quite done with it yet. We now have a Jokerized and much more deadly Condiment King on our hands. So not only is he spouting a whole lot of crazy thanks to his exposure to Joker venom, he also is wielding some dangerous knowledge that he gained in Arkham Asylum while learning at the feet of Poison Ivy, who taught him all kinds of things about naturally occurring herbs and spices that he was then able to weaponize and wield with gleeful abandon in his Jokerized state. So, yep, bottom line, Condiment King. Brought to you by Chuck Dixon in Birds of Prey number 37. The condiment is real. Now I've got a couple of entries from Marvel's Nuff Said Month event, which was Marvel Books cover dated February of 2002, like all the ongoing titles. This was all inspired by that famous issue of the G.I. Joe comic of the 80s, starring Snake Eyes, which was told entirely without words. And Marvel Comics decided for this 1 month in 2002 to challenge all of their creative teams to do one wordless issue, one mute issue. And here's the wording of that challenge as presented to readers of Marvel Mags in a text page that ran at the back of each Nuff Said issue. We dared them. That's right. Almost a year ago, Marvel Prez Bill Jemas and EIC Joe Quesada hatched a test for the mighty Marvel Maestros. Since you are the best artists and writers in the biz, we challenge you to tell a story using visuals only. After all, if a picture is worth 1,000 words, then a comic book filled with images only would be worth, well, more words than the collector could count. And if you think creating a story with no words is half the work, think again, true believer. The writer has to craft a story using no dialogue or caption boxes to communicate information. And pencilers have to make sure their storytelling is so clear that text isn't needed to explain what's going on. Just to show you how our mighty Marvel Maestros met the challenge, and to give you a unique peek behind the curtain, here's the plot to the very story you just read. Just compare it to the art and you'll see how the dare was done. And that is followed by actual excerpts of the script as submitted by the writer of each Nuff Said issue. It's kind of a cool peek behind the scenes there, mute issue stunt or not. It's kind of cool to see those scripts reproduced. And I have two Nuff Said issues to throw out here. Judd Winnick's Exiles, number 7, in partnership with Mike McCone and Mark McKenna. And they chose to go with the tried-and-true dream sequence option. So this story is just a collection of what all the different then-current members of the Exiles dream about. So it's got a bit of character insight, all accomplished without the benefit of dialogue. one of the more interesting and innovative uses of the Enough Said Month gimmick. And then I have Thunderbolts number 59 by Fabian Nicieza, Mark Bagley, and Al Vey. And Nicieza, clever scamp that he is, decided to make the wordlessness diegetic. It's not just a case of the characters in the story talking and we the readers can't hear what they're saying. Rather, in a conflict between Thunderbolt member Songbird and her ex-lover Angar the Screamer, another sonically powered character who was believed dead but lives on in kind of a solid sound wraith form, a sonic shade of his former self. And when he collides with Songbird, they end up creating a sonic null field that removes the ability to speak from all human beings for a mile or two around. And that's how we end up with a story that contains no words. So, kind of clever. And it also involves one of my favorite strange Bronze Age Marvel villains, Angar the Screamer, who is given kind of a touching send-off as his ex-lover, Songbird, formerly known as Screamin' Mimi, finds a way to set Angar's spirit free of its solid sound prison, and he's able to go on to whatever awaits him in the next life. It's fairly touching, and all the more powerful for the fact that it's done without words. So, there's Marvel's Nuff Said Month. Haven't decided yet whether we'll return to that in any greater length next time around. But for now, there's a couple of quick pops for you. Next to last, or penultimate tiny bubble I'm going to address here is something from Image. It's part of the Big Bang comics line, which I was all about in the 90s and early 2000s, even after it moved under the Image aegis. It's a loving tribute to those 80-page giant annuals that DC used to do back in the Silver Age. It's an Ultiman Giant. Ultiman Giant Annual number 1, and it's a collection of stories featuring the Big Bang Comics analog of Superman, Ultiman. It's always enjoy those little send-ups of classic superhero stories of the Golden Silver Ages and beyond. They did little pastiches of well-known Marvel and DC characters and concepts from all over the comic book history timeline. And focusing mainly on the Silver Age for this Ultiman Annual, of which I'm speaking. So, good fun there. And finally, one last pick from those wonderful discount bins at the Comic Swap in State College. One thing that I very clearly remember picking out of those bins because when it was first published in 2001, I passed it up with great regret and reluctance because the cover price was $5.95, which, adjusting for inflation, is about as outrageous as a $9.95 book at cover price coming out these days, as it very often does, and from this same publisher, DC. But it was The Green Arrow by Jack Kirby. It is a collection of all 11 Jack Kirby-drawn Green Arrow stories, which ran in Adventure Comics and World's Finest in 1958 and 1959. Kind of an interesting little bit of historical apocrypha there. Let me just give you the back cover blurb. It was 1958, and as hard as it may be to believe, just over a decade after he had helped Joe Simon create Captain America and the entire genre of romance comics, a year after devising The Challengers of the Unknown, and 3 years before he co-created the Fantastic Four and the entire Marvel Universe, Jack Kirby was looking for work. Comics had fallen upon hard times, and not only comics titles, but entire publishing houses were disappearing seemingly overnight. Jack had a family to support and was looking for work to pay the bills, and DC Comics offered him, you'll pardon the pun, a second-string backup strip, Green Arrow, which was appearing in Adventure Comics and, strangely enough, for a time concurrently in World's Finest Comics. Now you can own this little-seen and seldom reprinted work by perhaps comics' greatest creator ever, 11 stories by the great Jack Kirby, his wife Roz, who did some of the inking work for him, since Jack famously disliked inking, and didn't ink himself any more than he could help. And writers Ed Herron, Dave Wood, Bill Finger, and Robert Bernstein. So, yeah, some Green Arrow and some rare Kirbyana here. The first such Green Arrow story was from a script by Bill Finger, famously largely unheralded co-creator of the Batman. And sure enough, this story is really just kind of a bit of self-plagiarism on Bill Finger's part. The Green Arrows of the World, which is a blatant self-rip-off of the concept of the Batmen of many nations. It's just Green Arrow meeting a bunch of other Green Arrows from other countries as drawn by Jack Kirby. And Kirby got to get a little bit more of a free hand with the stories he illustrated, featuring the Green Arrow as this 11-story run rolls along. My personal favorite is when he travels to Dimension Zero and meets that world's version of Green Arrow, Zine Arrow, who is a gigantic alien being a mile high who still dresses in a Robin Hood cap and pixie boots and uses high-tech, futuristic alien trick arrows to defeat skyscraper-sized alien bad guys. And that's Zine Arrow with an X, if you were wondering. Xeen. I don't know if that's a color that they have in their electromagnetic spectrum in Dimension Zero that we don't have here. But and this collected volume contains an introduction by frequent Kirby unofficial biographer Mark Evan Neer, in which it is revealed that this series of Green Arrow backups is a slightly more historical footnote than we might think, because it was while Kirby was engaged in drawing this series of Green Arrow backups that he succeeded in ruffling a few feathers at DC, notably those of editor Mort Weisinger, who created Green Arrow back in the 40s, and was a little sensitive to the way the character was handled in DC Comics of that time. So he kind of made an enemy there, plus he also got into an argument with editor Jack Schiff, and it all added up to Kirby being temporarily blacklisted and rendered persona non grata at DC, which led somewhat directly to his going on to helping Stan Lee found the Marvel Universe a couple of years later. Just imagine what might have been if Kirby had hung around DC a little bit longer, and if he'd been given a little bit more of a free hand to influence the Green Arrow stories that he was drawing, and just to do his own thing creatively. How might comics history have been different if not for that? The answer is lost to time. And that, my dear friends, I believe brings this episode of Murd's Time Bubble to a satisfactory conclusion. Please return your tray tables to their upright and linear positions before exiting the craft. I thank you, as always, for joining me on this voyage through the comics time stream. I invite you, as always, as I did at the beginning of the episode, so at the end, bookending things neatly, to visit thecomicforums.vanillacommunity.com to leave some feedback about this episode, sound off on any of the comics that I've been talking about here, share your thoughts about your experience with the 9/11 disaster. Just stop in to say hi and how are you doing. And I look forward to joining you once again for a little time-tripping fireside chat about comics past. Stay cool, be good, enjoy the newly dawned baseball season, as I know I will be, and I will talk to you all again next time. But wait, there's more! Gotcha. I've still got this little April Fool's appendix to this episode with anniversary applicability. Yes, by near total coincidence, this episode of The Time Bubble is being released 10 years to the day after the release of my very first episode on April 1st, 2009. That's right, it's 10 years of The Time Bubble. Sol system subjective time, of course. And in that time, I've managed to release 32 episodes. That's an average of about 3.2 per year, for those of you who don't have an abacus handy. Also during that time, I have reviewed about a year and a half's worth of back issues, and I have allowed my ever-epic reading backlog to balloon from an 8-year pile to a 14-year pile. Suddenly, mock celebration no longer seems like quite such a great idea. Cancel the imaginary confetti, boys. I think I'm going to go read something, or maybe a month of something to celebrate instead. But anyway, thanks to all of you for being such loyal, regular chrono commuters with me during the past decade. I now return you to your regularly scheduled closing bumper. 10 years! Woohoo!